Hey guys, tonight we step into a past that looks rugged and romantic from a distance, but gets a lot less glamorous once you're actually inside it. You're about to wander through the Viking Age after dark, into a world where intimacy is public, power is uneven, and, you probably won't survive this, comfort, consent and privacy are not guaranteed the way you expect them to be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Is it late, early, somewhere in between? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing outside a longhouse as night falls. Smoke leaks from the roof vents, carrying the smell of peat, boiled meat, and damp wool. This is not a private world. When you step inside, you realise immediately that nighttime doesn't mean solitude. Bodies are everywhere. Family members, guests, servants, enslaved people. Everyone sleeps, eats, argues, and exists in the same elongated space. If sex happens here, and it does, it happens within earshot of others. The idea of a closed bedroom door simply doesn't exist for most people. That alone should recalibrate how you imagine intimacy in the Viking Age. You find a spot on a wooden bench, sharing it with someone's uncle and a pile of shields. The fire crackles low, and as people settle down, you notice how normalised physical closeness is. Touch isn't always romantic, it's practical. Warmth is survival. One historical fact often overlooked is that most Scandinavian homes before the late medieval period were single-room structures, meaning privacy was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy or very lucky. Sex, therefore, is woven into daily life, not separated from it. This doesn't make it freer, it makes it more regulated by social eyes. You start to feel how power fills the room more heavily than smoke. Who lies where matters. Who gets to initiate intimacy matters even more. A household head, usually male, usually older, controls not just property but people. Wives, concubines, enslaved individuals, children and guests all orbit around that authority. There's a quiet understanding here. Desire flows downhill. This is not a culture built around mutual exploration, but around status, lineage, and control of reproduction. Romance might happen, but it's not the point. Here's a quirky detail that sticks with you. In some sagas, sexual encounters are described not to excite, but to shame. Sex is a narrative weapon. To be penetrated, even metaphorically, is to be diminished. Insults revolve around who did what to whom, and whether it violated expected roles. That should tell you something important. Sex isn't private pleasure, it's public meaning. It defines honour, it defines weakness, it defines who gets mocked long after the act itself is forgotten. You listen to the night sounds, murmured conversations, coughing, the shuffle of straw bedding. Somewhere nearby, a couple shifts closer together. No one comments. Somewhere else, an enslaved woman is summoned quietly, and no one comments on that either. The silence isn't consent, it's normalisation. One open scholarly debate circles right here. How much agency did women and enslaved people truly have in these encounters? Some historians argue that legal rights, like the ability for women to divorce, suggest a level of autonomy. Others counter that social pressure and economic dependence made those rights theoretical at best. Sitting here, in this crowded darkness, it feels complicated, and intentionally so. You notice how youth is watched. Young men are expected to prove virility, but not too much. Too much desire makes you reckless. Young women are monitored for fertility and reputation. Sex before marriage is not unheard of, but it's risky, especially if it results in pregnancy. Children are survival assets, but only when their lineage is clear. This tension hums under every interaction. Even laughter has an edge to it. A fringe detail floats into your mind. Some sagas hint that people believed conception could be influenced by timing, position, or even spoken words. The idea that saying certain phrases during sex might affect the child's future crops up more than once. Scholars debate whether this reflects genuine belief or later Christian scribes misunderstanding pagan ideas. Either way, it shows how closely sex is tied to fate here, not pleasure. As the fire dims, you realise how little darkness actually hides. Firelight flickers across faces and shadows stretch but don't conceal much. This constant visibility acts like an unspoken rulebook. You behave because you are seen, or because you might be. It's a kind of social surveillance that shapes intimacy into something restrained, ritualized, and often unequal. There's no such thing as just between us. You think about how modern portrayals love to paint Vikings as sexually liberated, open marriages, wild feasts, fearless lovers. Sitting here, you feel the weight of something darker and quieter. Sex is frequent, yes, but it's also heavy with consequences. Pregnancy can kill, jealousy can start blood feuds, a poorly chosen partner can cost you land or life. Pleasure exists, but it's never alone in the room. The night deepens, someone snores loudly, someone else whispers a prayer, not Christian yet, but something older, murmured to unseen forces. You sense that sex here is not sinful in the later sense, but it is dangerous. It's a force to be managed, controlled, and narrated carefully. Tomorrow, people will remember who slept where. They always do. As you settle into the straw, eyes adjusting to the gloom, you understand that this is the foundation for everything that follows. Before laws, before sagas, before judgment, there is this crowded room, this shared air, this uneasy closeness. This is where Viking sexuality lives. Not in fantasy, but in smoke, hierarchy, and the long, watchful night. You wake before sunrise not because you're rested, but because someone nearby is already moving. That's how mornings begin here. Rustling straw, the scrape of a pot, a cough that echoes too loudly in the shared space. Night didn't really end, it just thinned out. As your eyes open, you realise how little separation there is between sleeping, waking, and remembering what happened after dark. Nothing resets. Everything carries over. You spend this morning thinking about how we even know any of this. Vikings didn't leave behind diaries titled How We Loved. What you have instead are fragments. Sagas written centuries later, law codes carved with brutal clarity, poems dense with metaphor, and archaeological evidence that refuses to explain itself. You're piecing together intimacy from a culture that preferred action to confession. One solid historical fact anchors you here. Most of what we know about Viking sexuality comes from Icelandic sagas written in the 12th and 13th centuries, long after the Viking Age itself had ended. Already you're dealing with memory filtered through time, politics, and Christianity. You sit near the doorway as daylight creeps in, listening to people argue about who's taking the animals out. It's mundane, but that's the point. Sex, too, is mundane in the sources, rarely described directly, almost never lingered on. When it appears, it's usually because something has gone wrong. An affair sparks a feud. A seduction leads to a lawsuit. A boast turns into an insult that can't be walked back. The silence around normal sex is one of the loudest clues you have. People didn't talk about it because they didn't need to. Everyone already understood the rules. A quirky detail surfaces as you think this through. In Old Norse poetry, sex is often described using agricultural metaphors. Ploughing, sowing, fields. It's not subtle, but it's indirect. Scholars argue whether this reflects modesty or simply a poetic tradition that treated sex as productive labour rather than emotional connection. Either way, it reinforces the idea that intimacy is about outcomes. Crops, children, alliances, not feelings. You watch a woman braid her hair with practiced speed. She knows exactly where she stands in this household, and that knowledge didn't come from guesswork. Law codes make it clear that while women had recognised legal status, able to inherit to divorce under certain conditions, that status existed within a deeply patriarchal framework. Consent, when discussed at all, is tangled up with ownership. Who had the right to offer a woman in marriage? Who was compensated if that right was violated? These are the questions that mattered most to lawmakers. Here's where scholarly debate heats up. Some historians argue that the ability for women to initiate divorce suggests meaningful sexual autonomy. Others point out that divorce often required public declarations and the support of male kin, making it socially risky and economically devastating. As you sit here, watching who speaks and who stays quiet, it's hard to believe autonomy was ever simple. Choice existed, but it was narrow, conditional, and watched. You step outside briefly, letting cold air clear the smoke from your lungs. The settlement is quiet, but not asleep. Somewhere, a couple argues in low voices. Somewhere else, someone laughs too loudly, too early. The land itself feels like part of the conversation. Fertility matters because winters kill. Children matter because labour matters. Sex is how the future gets made, and the future is always uncertain. That pressure seeps into every relationship. Foreign observers noticed this, even if they misunderstood it. One historical account from an Arab traveller describes Norse people bathing together and appearing shockingly unconcerned with nudity. Modern readers often jump from that to assumptions of sexual freedom, but nudity is not the same thing as equality, and openness is not the same thing as safety. The sources don't describe a culture obsessed with pleasure, they describe one obsessed with order. You think about the sagas again, how often sex is implied rather than shown. A woman is taken into a bed. A man lays claim. The language is passive, transactional. When desire appears, it's dangerous. Characters who act purely on lust tend to die badly. This isn't a moral lesson about sin, it's a practical warning about chaos. Sex that ignores hierarchy threatens the social fabric, and the stories punish that threat. A fringe belief drifts into your thoughts. Some scholars suggest that certain sexual taboos, especially around men taking receptive roles, were less about morality and more about fear of social inversion. To be penetrated was to be dominated, and domination belonged to the powerful. The insult wasn't about desire, it was about status. That interpretation is debated fiercely, but it fits what you see. Everything here is about who stands above whom. As the day settles into routine, you notice how quickly the conversation moves on from last night. No one recaps, no one confesses. Memory is selective, and silence is strategic. What isn't said can't be used against you later. In a culture where insults can escalate into killings, discretion is survival. Sex leaves traces, but people are careful about which ones they acknowledge. You realise that boredom is part of the story too. Long stretches of labour, cold, hunger, repetition. Sex is not a constant thrill. It's folded into exhaustion. That's something the myths rarely show. Real intimacy here happens between chores, between crises, between winters. It's squeezed into the cracks of a hard life. As evening approaches again, you feel how understanding the sources changes how you see the acts themselves. You're not looking for scandal anymore. You're looking for patterns, for absences, for the moments where writers suddenly get very specific. Those moments usually mean danger, shame, or conflict. Normality, whatever that looked like, stayed off the page. The fire will be lit again soon. People will lie down again, close enough to hear each other breathe. And you, carrying these half-truths and debates, are starting to understand that Viking sexuality isn't hidden because it was wild. It's hidden because it was regulated, heavy, and rarely worth romanticising. The darkness isn't just in the acts themselves, it's in what the sources choose to show you and what they very carefully leave out. Morning chores blur into one another, and as you help passively, handing a tool here, stepping aside there, you begin to notice how many conversations revolve around marriages that already exist, or marriages yet to come. Names are mentioned with a kind of careful neutrality, as if everyone is aware that these unions are less about affection and more about strategy. In this world, marriage is not the climax of a love story. It's a contract, a hinge on which land, livestock, and loyalty swing. You sit on an overturned bucket while two older men talk quietly near the doorway. They're not gossiping, they're negotiating. A daughter here, a tract of land there, a promise of support if things go badly next winter. One solid historical fact grounds this moment. Viking Age marriages were legally binding agreements between families, often sealed with bride wealth payments that compensated the bride's family for her transfer into another household. Love might follow later, but it's never the opening argument. You feel the weight of how final these arrangements can be. Once a marriage is agreed upon, backing out isn't just embarrassing, it's dangerous. Feuds have started over broken engagements. Honour is on the line, and honour here is a currency more valuable than silver. Sex, within this framework, becomes something expected, almost mandatory. Producing heirs isn't a romantic hope. It's a duty tied to survival and legacy. A woman passes by, heavily pregnant, moving with practiced steadiness. Her marriage, you suspect, was arranged years ago. You wonder how much choice she had. Scholars argue over this endlessly. Some point out that women's consent is occasionally mentioned in the sources, suggesting their approval mattered. Others counter that consent given under social pressure is hardly freedom. Watching her now, you sense both strength and constraint. She's central to the future of this household, and yet her path was likely chosen long before she could imagine it. Here's a quirky detail that complicates things. Sagas sometimes describe couples who genuinely grow fond of one another after marriage, even sharing jokes or quiet moments. These glimpses are rare but telling. They suggest that affection wasn't absent, it just wasn't the point. Marriage created a framework in which affection might safely exist, contained within socially approved boundaries. Love without structure was risky. Love with witnesses was safer. You listen as someone jokes about a man whose wife wears the trousers, a phrase that earns laughter and a few raised eyebrows. Gender expectations are rigid, but not unbreakable. A strong-willed woman managing household affairs isn't unheard of, especially if her husband is away or ineffective. Still, that strength exists within marriage, not outside it. Marriage legitimizes power. Without it, a woman's position is far more precarious. There's an open scholarly debate that hovers here like smoke. Were Viking marriages primarily oppressive, or did they offer women one of the few stable forms of protection available at the time? The answer, frustratingly, seems to be both. Marriage could trap someone in a violent or unhappy situation. It could also shield them from poverty, enslavement, or social isolation. Sitting here, watching alliances form in low voices, you realise how little room there is for idealism. The afternoon drags on, and with it comes talk of dowries and expectations. Property isn't just exchanged, it's bound to future behaviour. A wife is expected to be faithful, yes, but also industrious, fertile, and loyal to her husband's kin. A husband is expected to provide, protect, and represent the household in public disputes. Sexual exclusivity is less about intimacy and more about clarity of inheritance. Uncertainty is the enemy. A fringe belief slips into your awareness. Some stories suggest that consummation itself had ritual importance, that a marriage wasn't fully valid until sex occurred. This idea is debated, but it fits the broader pattern. Sex seals contracts. Bodies confirm promises that words alone can't. In that sense, intimacy becomes almost ceremonial, a physical signature at the bottom of an agreement. You notice how young people are watched during gatherings, a glance held too long, a laugh shared too freely. Everyone is aware of the consequences of desire slipping its leash. Premarital sex isn't unheard of, but it's a gamble. If it leads to pregnancy, the negotiations begin again, often tensely. Who will claim responsibility? Who will pay compensation? Marriage becomes the solution to scandal as often as it is the cause of celebration. As evening approaches, you sit near the fire again, thinking about how different this is from the modern idea of marriage as personal fulfillment. Here, fulfillment is secondary. Stability comes first. That doesn't mean people don't feel deeply. It means feelings are expected to bend around necessity. You imagine what it would be like to enter a lifelong partnership, knowing it was designed by others, for reasons larger than yourself. It's sobering. You overhear someone mention divorce casually, almost offhand. That catches your attention. Yes, divorce exists here. That's another historical fact that often surprises people. Under certain conditions, abandonment, violence, failure to provide, marriage could be dissolved. But divorce is not easy. It requires witnesses, public declarations, and often leaves one or both parties economically strained. The option exists, but it's not freedom in the modern sense. It's an escape hatch with a cost. The firelight flickers, and faces soften in its glow. Married couples sit together, not always touching, but clearly paired. Their bond is visible to everyone else, a social signal as much as a personal one. Sex within marriage is expected, regulated, and judged by its outcomes. Are there children? Are there heirs? Are there disputes? Pleasure is private if it exists at all. As the night deepens, you realise how marriage frames everything that follows in this culture's sexual landscape. It defines what is acceptable, what is punishable, and what is negotiable. Outside of it, desire is dangerous. Inside it, desire is managed. Either way, it's never just between two people. You settle back, listening to the low murmur of voices fade into sleep. Tomorrow will bring more negotiations, more alliances, more quiet calculations about bodies and futures. And you're starting to see that in the Viking Age, sex is rarely about who you want. It's about what your wanting does to everyone else. You wake with the uneasy sense that rules are tightening around you, invisible but firm, like cords drawn just beneath the surface of daily life. Today, conversation sounds sharper. Words like right, wrong, owed, and taken slip into speech more often. You're beginning to feel where sex intersects most uncomfortably with Viking society: law, consent, and power. This is where the calm bedtime tone gets heavier, not louder, because the weight here doesn't need dramatizing. You follow a small group toward what passes for a legal gathering. It's informal, no benches, no robes, but everyone stands a little straighter. Law in the Viking Age isn't abstract. It's performed, spoken aloud, remembered by people whose job it is to remember. One historical fact anchors you immediately. Viking societies relied on oral law codes recited at assemblies called things, where disputes, including sexual ones, were resolved publicly. Privacy ends the moment a grievance is spoken. You listen as a case is discussed, not in graphic detail but in careful language. A woman was taken improperly. Compensation is debated. Notice what's missing. The question isn't, did she want this? The question is, who was wronged? And the answer points not to her feelings, but to ownership. Her husband, her father, her family. Consent exists here, but it's filtered through hierarchy. It matters most when it disrupts male authority or inheritance. This is where modern ears struggle, and rightly so. Some scholars argue that Viking law recognised sexual violence as a serious crime, citing fines and outlawry for offenders. Others counter that the penalties often depended on the woman's status: free, married, enslaved, and that tells you everything. A free woman violated without consent could trigger a feud. An enslaved woman violated rarely triggered anything at all. Sitting here, you feel the imbalance settle in your chest. A quirky but telling detail surfaces in your mind. Old Norse law sometimes distinguished between rape committed by force and sex obtained by deception. Both could be punished, but the framing reveals something uncomfortable. The law is less interested in trauma than in disruption. Sex is illegal when it destabilizes social order, not necessarily when it harms an individual. That distinction changes how you hear every case. You watch faces as the discussion continues. No one looks shocked. No one looks confused. This is familiar territory. Power dynamics are understood intuitively. A high-status man accused of misconduct is discussed cautiously. A low-status man is discussed bluntly. The outcome feels predictable before it's spoken. Law here isn't blind. It's sharply observant of rank. There's an open, scholarly debate that circles this moment endlessly. Did Viking women have meaningful sexual consent? Or was consent always secondary to male negotiation? Some historians point to stories of women refusing suitors, even mocking them publicly, as evidence of agency. Others note that refusal is safest when backed by powerful kin. Alone, it's dangerous. Watching this play out, you suspect both are true, depending on who's standing behind you. As the gathering disperses, you notice how quickly people return to routine. Law doesn't linger. It resolves, compensates, or condemns, and then life moves on. There's no counselling, no healing period. The body remembers, but the community expects function. Sex, lawful or not, leaves marks that the legal system doesn't address. That gap is quiet but vast. You walk with someone who mutters an insult under their breath about another man's masculinity. It's sexual, of course. These insults always are. Accusations of passivity, of being used, of failing to dominate properly. Here's a fringe interpretation scholars still argue over. Sexual insults function less as commentary on desire, and more as shorthand for political weakness. To call someone sexually submissive was to call them unfit to lead. Desire itself wasn't the crime. Misplaced power was. You think back to the longhouse at night. Who lies closest to the fire? Who gets space? Who doesn't? Consent here is rarely a simple yes or no. It's shaped by survival, by threat, by expectation. Saying no might be legally permissible but socially costly. Saying yes might be safer even if it isn't wanted. The law recognises force, but it doesn't recognise pressure very well. Later you hear a story told half-jokingly about a woman who cleverly trapped a man into marriage by publicly claiming intimacy. Laughter follows, but it's edged. This tactic worked because reputation matters so deeply. Once a claim is made, denying it risks legal trouble or worse. Sex becomes leverage. Agency exists, but it's exercised through social traps rather than open choice. That's not empowerment, it's navigation. Another historical fact surfaces quietly. Children born from unlawful unions could still be acknowledged, and even inherit under certain circumstances. This complicates the picture. Sexual transgressions don't always erase legitimacy, they rearrange it. The law flexes when necessary, especially if powerful men are involved. Justice here is negotiable. As dusk approaches, you realise how much energy goes into managing appearances. Desire is dangerous not because it's immoral, but because it's unpredictable. Law tries to box it in with fines, oaths and witnesses, but people slip through. When they do, the consequences ripple outward. Feuds, divorces, alliances broken or forged. You sit near the fire again, watching sparks rise and vanish. It occurs to you that consent in the Viking Age isn't absent, but it's incomplete. It's a concept still forming, tangled in ideas of property and honour. People know coercion is wrong, they just don't always agree on why or for whom. The night settles, and with it comes a familiar tension. Somewhere, someone will cross a line. Somewhere else, someone will stay silent because speaking costs too much. The law will catch some of it. The rest will sink into memory, into saga, into rumour. And you're left with the unsettling understanding that power, more than desire, decides how sex is judged here. As you close your eyes, you feel the weight of these unspoken rules pressing gently but persistently. Tomorrow, you'll see where this imbalance leads. Into households where secondary partners exist, where captivity blurs into intimacy. For now, you drift off knowing that in this world, consent is real, but power speaks louder. You wake with the lingering discomfort of unfinished thoughts, the kind that sit heavy in the chest rather than the head. Today, that weight takes a clearer shape. You're about to step into one of the most normalized, least romanticized aspects of Viking sexuality: concubinage and captivity. There's no dramatic announcement, no sudden tonal shift. It's treated as matter of fact here, which somehow makes it harder to sit with. You notice it first in the household structure. Not everyone sleeping under this roof holds the same status, and not everyone sharing intimacy here arrived by choice. Some people are wives, some are servants, some are enslaved captives taken during raids or traded along long-established routes. Sex doesn't distinguish sharply between these categories. Power does. One historical fact sets the stage clearly. Viking societies practiced slavery, and enslaved people, known as thralls, were considered property under the law, with extremely limited legal protection. You watch a man speak casually to a young woman who doesn't meet his eyes. Her movements are careful, measured, practiced. She belongs to the household, but not to herself. When she's summoned, she goes. No one comments. This isn't secrecy, it's normalization. Concubinage, ongoing sexual relationships outside formal marriage, exist openly, especially for wealthy or powerful men. It's not scandalous, it's status. Here's a detail that feels almost mundane until you sit with it. Children born from concubines are not automatically outcasts. In some cases, they can be acknowledged, raised alongside legitimate heirs, or even inherit if formally recognized. Scholars debate how common this was, but the possibility alone tells you something important. Sex with captives isn't just tolerated, it's structurally absorbed into society. The system bends to accommodate it. You feel the imbalance sharpen when you realize how little choice is ever discussed for the captive. Sagas rarely describe their feelings. Law codes barely mention their consent. Their silence isn't accidental. It reflects a worldview where certain bodies are resources, labour, reproduction, leverage. Desire here is something done to them, not something they express. A quirky but unsettling detail surfaces from the sources. Some sagas give enslaved women names that describe physical traits or origins rather than identities. The Irish woman, the dark-haired one. Scholars argue whether this reflects narrative shorthand or genuine dehumanization. Sitting here, watching how little attention is paid to these individuals, it feels uncomfortably close to the latter. You overhear a conversation about a recent raid. There's pride in the telling, goods taken, enemies routed, prestige earned. The mention of captives comes almost as an afterthought, lumped in with livestock and tools. This is where the bedtime pacing slows deliberately. You're meant to feel the monotony of cruelty, not its spectacle. Captivity is part of the economic engine. Sex is one of its byproducts. There's an open scholarly debate that hovers here like fog. To what extent did concubines integrate into households? And did that integration ever soften their status? Some historians point to evidence of long-term relationships, children, and even emotional bonds forming. Others argue that these interpretations risk projecting modern ideas of attachment onto fundamentally coercive arrangements. You find yourself leaning toward caution. Familiarity doesn't equal freedom. As the day unfolds, you see how concubinage reinforces hierarchy rather than disrupting it. A man with multiple sexual partners isn't seen as immoral, he's seen as successful. His ability to support them is proof of his standing. A woman in a similar position would face ridicule or worse. Sexual double standards aren't hidden here, they're structural. You also notice how wives navigate this reality. Some ignore concubines entirely, some exert quiet authority over them, assigning work, controlling access. This isn't jealousy in the modern sense, it's management. The household must function, and emotions are secondary to order. That doesn't mean resentment doesn't exist, it means it's rarely safe to express. A fringe interpretation pops into your mind. Some scholars suggest that concubinage served as a pressure valve, allowing elite men sexual access without destabilizing inheritance lines. It's a grimly efficient system. Marriage produces legitimate heirs. Concubinage absorbs excess desire and conquest. Everyone knows where they stand. That clarity is the point. You think back to the law gathering from yesterday. Enslaved people barely appeared there. When they did, it was as property to be compensated for, not as victims or complainants. Sexual violence against them is rarely framed as a crime unless it damages someone else's interests. This isn't a failure of the system. It is the system, functioning exactly as designed. As evening approaches, you sit outside and watch shadows lengthen. A captive woman carries water past you, eyes down, shoulders tight. You wonder how often intimacy here feels indistinguishable from obligation. How often resistance is internal because external resistance is futile. The sources don't tell you. Their silence feels intentional, or at least convenient. Another historical fact settles in quietly. The Viking slave trade connected Scandinavia to Ireland, Eastern Europe, and beyond. This wasn't a marginal practice. It was central to wealth and expansion. Sex with captives wasn't an aberration. It was an expected consequence of conquest. Understanding that reframes everything. Desire follows power because power creates opportunity. You hear laughter from inside the longhouse. Life goes on, meals are shared, stories are told, children play, some of them born from these unequal unions. Time blurs edges that morality sharpens. That's what makes this part so unsettling. There's no villain twirling a moustache, just people participating in a system that rewards domination. As night falls, you lie down again among others, the familiar closeness returning. Somewhere nearby, intimacy unfolds that carries none of the mutuality you're used to imagining. No one interrupts, no one questions it. This is not chaos, it's order, grim and efficient. You realize that concubinage and captivity form a bridge between sex and violence in this world. They reveal how intimacy can be stripped of reciprocity and still be considered normal. That understanding darkens everything you've learned so far. Marriage, consent, law. They all operate differently when some people are excluded from personhood altogether. As sleep creeps in, you know the next step in this journey will take you even deeper into that exclusion, into the daily sexual realities of slavery itself, beyond the household, beyond recognition. For now, you rest with the uneasy truth that in the Viking Age, sex often follows conquest, and the system rarely asks who pays the cost. You wake with the sense that yesterday only skimmed the surface. Today you're not looking at concubinage as an extension of status, but at slavery itself as a daily grinding reality, one that shapes sexual access in ways so ordinary they barely register to the people living inside them. There's no dramatic reveal, just routine, and that's what makes it heavy. You notice how enslaved people move differently. They anticipate needs before they're spoken. They hover at the edges of conversations, close enough to hear orders, far enough to avoid eye contact. Their bodies are always available, for labour, for errands, and, unspoken but understood, for sex. One historical fact settles this plainly. Under Viking law, enslaved people were property, and sexual access to them by their owners was largely unrestricted and unregulated. That reality reshapes intimacy entirely. There is no courtship here, no negotiation. Sex happens because someone with power decides it will. You realise how misleading it is to even use the word intimacy. What's happening is proximity plus authority. The sources don't linger on it because to them, there's nothing remarkable to describe. A master using a thrall's body is as unnoteworthy as using their hands. You watch a household head gesture casually, and an enslaved woman follows him behind a partition made of hanging cloth. The barrier is thin. Sounds travel. No one looks up. No one needs to. This isn't secrecy. It's etiquette. You're not meant to stare, not because it's shameful, but because it's none of your business. Ownership makes it ordinary. A quirky detail from the sagas drifts into your mind. Enslaved characters are often described only at moments of violence or betrayal, rarely during moments of care or pleasure. Scholars argue whether this absence suggests indifference or narrative economy. Sitting here, it feels like erasure. If pleasure or resistance existed, it wasn't considered worth recording. You think about how children fit into this. Some enslaved women bear children fathered by their owners. The child's status depends entirely on acknowledgement. Recognised children might be freed, raised within the household, even given opportunities. Unrecognised children inherit their mother's status, enslaved from birth. This isn't cruelty by accident. It's a system designed to keep lines clear and labour renewable. Here's where scholarly debate sharpens. Some historians argue that manumission, freeing enslaved people, was common enough to suggest pathways out of bondage, including through sexual relationships. Others counter that emphasizing rare success stories risks minimizing the overwhelming permanence of enslavement. You look around and see no signs of upward mobility today, just repetition. You notice how enslaved men are treated differently. Their sexual vulnerability is rarely discussed in sources, which doesn't mean it didn't exist. It means it was even less speakable. Power still dictates roles. Sexual domination of men threatens social hierarchies more visibly, so it's buried deeper in silence. Absence, again, is doing the talking. As the day moves on, you see how exhaustion compounds everything. Enslaved bodies are tired bodies. Consent in a world where saying no is impossible becomes a meaningless concept. There's no room for refusal, and no reward for compliance beyond temporary safety. That safety can vanish on a whim. Desire, here, isn't even the driver. Convenience is. A fringe idea floats through academic discussions. Some scholars suggest that sexual access to enslaved people functioned as a bonding mechanism for warrior elites, a shared entitlement that reinforced group cohesion. It's debated and uncomfortable, but it fits the pattern you see. Shared power creates shared silence. You think about disease, pregnancy, and risk. There's no evidence of consistent concern for the health of enslaved sexual partners beyond their ability to work. Pregnancy might reduce labour temporarily, but it also produces more property. The calculus is brutal and efficient. Bodies are resources, and reproduction is multiplication. Later, you overhear a joke made at an enslaved person's expense. It lands flat but goes unchallenged. Humour here punches down, reinforcing the boundary between person and property. Sexual jokes are common, but they're never self-directed by those without power. That alone tells you who is allowed desire and who is reduced to it. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Christian writers later condemned Scandinavian sexual practices with enslaved people as particularly immoral, suggesting the practice was widespread enough to be noticed. Moral outrage often tracks prevalence. The criticism isn't proof of excess, it's proof of normality. As evening approaches, you feel how slavery warps every other sexual relationship in this world. Marriage looks different when alternatives exist that require no negotiation. Consent looks different when refusal is punishable. Even affection, when it appears, is suspect, because affection doesn't erase ownership, it just complicates it. You watch a wife issue instructions to an enslaved woman without looking at her. The power dynamic is layered. Gender doesn't override status. A free woman outranks an enslaved man. An enslaved woman answers to everyone. This hierarchy keeps resentment diffuse and resistance rare. Everyone knows exactly where they stand. There's a moment that sticks with you. An enslaved person laughs, genuinely it seems, at something a child says. For a second, humanity breaks through the structure. Then someone calls for them sharply, and the moment snaps shut. The system tolerates labour and obedience. It does not tolerate forgetting one's place. You return to the longhouse as night settles again. The same thin barriers, the same shared air. Somewhere, sex happens without mutuality, without language, without pause. The sources won't describe it. The law won't address it. Society won't question it. That silence is the loudest thing you've heard yet. As you lie down, you realize how slavery underpins the entire sexual order you've been observing. It absorbs violence. It normalizes coercion. It creates a baseline against which all other relationships are measured and justified. Compared to slavery, everything else looks voluntary. Sleep comes slowly. Tomorrow you'll step back from the household and look upward, to gods, rituals and fertility beliefs that try to make sense of sex in a world this harsh. For now, you rest with the understanding that in the Viking Age, intimacy without freedom is not an exception. It's a foundation. You wake with the feeling that something unseen has been hovering over everything you've witnessed so far. Today, you begin to notice how people look beyond themselves, beyond law, beyond power, toward forces they believe shape desire, fertility, and survival itself. Sex here is not only social, it's cosmic, and that belief changes how it's practiced, explained, and excused. You follow a small group beyond the settlement, past fields still stiff with morning frost. Someone has brought food, someone else carries a carved object worn smooth by years of handling. This isn't a formal ceremony, but it's not casual either. One historical fact grounds this moment. Pre-Christian Viking societies practiced ritual offerings, blot, to gods associated with fertility, harvests and prosperity, often timed to agricultural cycles. Sex, crops and survival are braided tightly together. You feel how natural this connection seems to them. A good harvest means full bellies. Full bellies mean children survive winter. Children mean lineage continues. Fertility isn't romantic here, it's existential. Sex becomes a kind of prayer, whether spoken aloud or enacted quietly. When conception fails, it's not just disappointment, it's fear. Someone murmurs a name, Freya, the god most closely linked with fertility and abundance. His stories are blunt, even crude at times. He desires openly. He takes risks for pleasure. Scholars debate whether Freya's sexuality was meant to model abundance or warn against excess. Standing here, you suspect it's both. Desire is powerful, power is dangerous. That duality runs through every ritual gesture. A quirky detail surfaces from later sources. Some accounts describe sacred objects, possibly symbolic phalluses, used in fertility rites, sometimes carried through communities during festivals. Whether these descriptions reflect real pagan practice or Christian exaggeration is debated hotly. But the persistence of the imagery suggests something real underneath. Sexual symbolism wasn't hidden, it was activated. You notice how women feature prominently in these moments. They're not sidelined. They lead chants, prepare offerings, interpret signs. This complicates the picture you've been forming. While daily life limits women's power, ritual space sometimes expands it. Scholars argue over whether this reflects genuine religious authority or temporary symbolic elevation. Watching the seriousness with which people listen, it feels more than decorative. There's an open scholarly debate here that refuses to settle. Were fertility rituals participatory, involving sexual acts, or purely symbolic? Some interpret poetic references to holy unions as metaphor. Others suggest ritualized sex between humans, or symbolically between humans and gods, played a role. The evidence is thin, filtered through hostile Christian writers, but the ambiguity itself tells you something. Sex was sacred enough to be dangerous to later sensibilities. You think back to slavery and coercion, and you feel the tension. Ritual doesn't erase hierarchy. An offering made by an enslaved person isn't an act of choice, it's obligation. Even sacred sex, if it occurred, wouldn't magically become consensual. Belief doesn't dissolve power, it sanctifies it. That realization sits quietly, heavy but clarifying. As the group disperses, you hear someone joke about waking the land. Laughter follows, but it's nervous. There's always the fear that rituals might fail, that gods might withhold favour. When that happens, blame follows. A woman who doesn't conceive, a couple whose children die young, sex becomes suspect. Was it done correctly, at the right time, with the right respect? A fringe belief flickers through the scholarship. Some suggest that seasonal sexual taboos existed, restricting intercourse at certain times to align with agricultural rhythms. Evidence is scattered, but it fits the worldview. Sex isn't constant indulgence, it's timed, managed, directed toward outcomes larger than the individuals involved. You walk back toward the settlement as clouds roll in. The weather itself feels like a message. Rain can be blessing or curse. Fertility rituals don't guarantee success. They negotiate with uncertainty. That's why they persist. In a world without control, meaning becomes currency. You notice how these beliefs bleed into everyday explanations. A healthy child is a sign of divine favour. Infertility is whispered about, sometimes attributed to curses, sometimes to improper behaviour. Sex here carries moral weight without moralising language. It's not sinful, it's consequential. Another historical fact settles in. Seder, a form of Norse magic often associated with prophecy and fate, was linked symbolically with sexual transgression and power. Practitioners, often women, were both respected and feared. Sexual ambiguity and supernatural ability blur together. Scholars argue whether this reflects anxiety about gender roles or genuine belief in erotic magic. Either way, sexuality and mysticism are intertwined. As evening approaches, you sense how ritual provides a narrative people can live with. Slavery, coercion, loss. These things become tolerable when folded into a cosmic story. Sex doesn't just make children, it maintains balance. It keeps the world turning. That belief doesn't excuse harm, but it explains endurance. You sit near the fire again, watching someone carve symbols into wood. The motions are repetitive, soothing. Someone mentions an upcoming festival where boundaries loosen, where drink flows, where fertility is celebrated openly. For a brief moment each year, rules bend. Scholars debate whether these festivals allowed temporary sexual freedom. If they did, it was contained, expected, and quickly reined back in. Even chaos is scheduled. You feel how rituals offer relief without revolution. They acknowledge desire without challenging hierarchy. They allow people to feel connected to something larger while staying firmly in place. Sex, in this framework, is never just personal. It's communal, agricultural, divine. As night settles, you realize that fertility beliefs don't soften the darkness you've been tracing. They explain it. They wrap it in meaning, give it rhythm, make it survivable. Tomorrow you'll turn from gods back to people, specifically to the expectations placed on men and women as they carry these beliefs into daily behaviour. For now, you drift off with the steady thought that in the Viking Age sex is never isolated. It belongs to land, to gods, to survival itself. And once something belongs to everyone, it rarely belongs fully to the individual. You wake into expectations today. They're not spoken outright, but they press in from every side, shaping posture, tone, even the way people laugh. Gender here isn't just identity, it's instruction. It tells you how to move through the world, how to desire, and how much room you're allowed to take up when sex enters the conversation. You watch the morning unfold with new eyes. Men gather tools, weapons, plans. Women organise food, children, textiles, the subtle logistics that keep the household functioning. None of this is accidental. One historical fact anchors the pattern. Viking Age society was rigidly gendered in labour and law, with clear expectations for masculine and feminine behaviour tied directly to honour and survival. Sex doesn't sit outside these roles, it reinforces them. You notice how early these expectations begin. Boys are teased about future strength, future conquests, future wives. Girls are praised for diligence, quiet competence, and eventual fertility. Desire is shaped before it's even felt. When sex comes later, it slots neatly into a pre-written script. Deviate too far, and the consequences ripple outward. A quirky detail surfaces as you listen to casual insults exchanged between men. They're almost always sexual and almost always gendered. To accuse a man of being womanly isn't about femininity. It's about passivity, dependence, failure to dominate. Scholars argue that these insults reflect fear of social inversion more than fear of desire itself. Sitting here, it's clear that masculinity is fragile, constantly needing reinforcement. You watch how women navigate this space. They're expected to be modest, but not ignorant. Sex isn't hidden from them, it's anticipated. A woman who understands her role within marriage is valued. One who appears too eager or too resistant risks gossip. This tightrope walk is exhausting to witness. Agency exists, but it's exercised within narrow lanes. There's an open, scholarly debate that pulses through this moment. Were Viking women unusually empowered compared to their medieval European counterparts, or does that comparison set the bar far too low? Evidence of property rights and divorce suggests relative autonomy. Evidence of sexual double standards suggests otherwise. The truth, as always, seems to live in the tension. Empowerment without equality is still constraint. You see how motherhood cements identity. A woman with children gains authority, respect, and security. A woman without them becomes suspect, pitied, or blamed. Fertility beliefs you observed yesterday bleed directly into social value today. Sex isn't just expected of women, it's demanded by the future. Failure isn't private, it's communal disappointment. Men, meanwhile, are expected to balance aggression with control. Too little desire suggests weakness, too much suggests recklessness. A man who can't secure a household or produce heirs risks ridicule. Sex becomes proof of competence. That pressure fuels conquest, concubinage, and entitlement. Desire isn't just personal appetite, it's performance. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes raise feels uncomfortably plausible. Rigid gender roles around sex may have functioned to stabilize a violent society by channeling aggression into predictable patterns. Marriage, dominance, reproduction, all of it creates structure. That structure limits chaos, but it also limits humanity. You think back to slavery and notice how gender expectations fracture along status lines. An enslaved man is stripped of masculine honor. An enslaved woman is reduced almost entirely to reproductive potential. Gender roles don't disappear under slavery. They distort, amplifying vulnerability rather than identity. Power overrides everything. As the day goes on, you hear stories told lightly that carry heavy messages. A woman praised for enduring a difficult marriage without complaint. A man mocked for failing to control his household. These stories aren't entertainment, they're instruction manuals. Sex within them is never neutral. It's evidence. Another historical fact slips in quietly. Cross-dressing and gender nonconformity appear in myth and saga, often associated with magic or deception. Loki shifts genders. Gods blur boundaries. In myth, this fluidity is fascinating, even powerful. In daily life, it's dangerous. Scholars debate whether myth provided a safe space to explore forbidden ideas or reinforced taboos by isolating them in the divine. Either way, everyday people were expected to stay firmly in their lanes. You notice how shame operates differently depending on gender. A woman's sexual misstep follows her like a shadow. A man's can be reframed as youthful error or boldness, depending on outcome. This asymmetry isn't accidental. It protects lineage clarity and male authority. Sex becomes another system of accounting. As evening approaches, you watch a young couple exchange glances across the longhouse. It's tender, brief, cautious. Desire exists here, undeniably. But it's filtered through layers of expectation. Will this lead to marriage? Is it appropriate? Who's watching? Even affection feels supervised. You sit near the fire and realize how exhausting it must be to live inside these roles without language to question them. Gender expectations don't announce themselves as rules. They feel like nature. That's what makes them powerful. Sex that aligns with them feels normal. Sex that doesn't feels wrong, even if no one can explain why. A debate among scholars echoes softly. Were these roles ever contested openly, or only navigated quietly? The sagas tend to celebrate those who conform or cleverly manipulate the system, not those who reject it outright. Survival favours adaptation over rebellion. You've seen that pattern everywhere. As night deepens, you feel the weight of continuity. The same expectations will greet tomorrow's children, and their children after them. Sex doesn't just reproduce bodies here, it reproduces roles. Each generation inherits not only genes, but scripts. You lie down again, straw shifting beneath you, and think about how gender expectations shape everything you've seen so far. Marriage, consent, slavery, ritual. They're the connective tissue. Without them, the system wouldn't hold. With them, it persists. Tomorrow, you'll look closer at masculinity itself, how honor, dominance, and restraint twist male sexuality into something both prized and policed. For now, you drift towards sleep with the quiet understanding that in the Viking Age, to desire is human, but to desire correctly is everything. You wake today to a quieter pressure, heavier somehow because it's internal. Masculinity here isn't just enforced by others, it's monitored from the inside. You can feel it in the way men stretch when they stand, the way they lower their voices when talking about disputes, the way laughter cuts off too sharply if it drifts toward vulnerability. Sex for men in this world is not merely something they do, it's something they must prove. You sit near a group sharpening blades, listening without appearing to. Stories surface, some about raids, some about feasts, but many drift inevitably toward women, conquest, and reputation. One historical fact grounds the pattern. Viking Age masculinity was inseparable from honour, and honour was public, fragile, and constantly at risk of challenge. Sexual reputation was one of its pillars. You notice how carefully men talk around failure. A man without a wife is discussed with polite concern. A man without children draws quieter judgment. Sexual incapacity, if suspected, is devastating. It's rarely stated outright, but jokes hover close, circling like birds. To be unable to perform sexually is to be unable to perform socially. Virility equals credibility. A quirky detail emerges from saga literature. Accusations of sexual inadequacy or passivity are among the most dangerous insults a man can receive, often provoking lethal violence. Scholars note that these insults are treated as legal matters, not just hurt feelings. That alone tells you how seriously masculinity is taken. Words about sex can kill because they destabilize honour. You watch a younger man listening intently as an older one recounts a past affair, not lovingly, but triumphantly. The lesson isn't about intimacy, it's about dominance. Sexual success is framed as evidence of control over oneself and others. Desire that overwhelms judgment is mocked. Desire that submits to another's will is unforgivable. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath these observations. Was Viking masculinity inherently hypersexual, or was sexual restraint actually the ideal? Some argue that the constant emphasis on honour suggests discipline mattered more than indulgence. Others point to the prevalence of concubinage and sexual boasting as evidence of entitlement. Sitting here, it feels like both are true. Masculinity demands desire, but only when it confirms status. You notice how fear threads through all of this. Fear of ridicule, fear of emasculation, fear of being talked about when you're not in the room. That fear polices behaviour more effectively than law ever could. Men perform heterosexual dominance not only because it's expected, but because the alternative is social death. A fringe interpretation some scholars raise lingers in your mind. Viking masculinity may have been shaped less by erotic impulse, and more by anxiety about power. Sexual dominance reassures a man that he hasn't slipped down the hierarchy. In a violent, competitive world, reassurance matters. Sex becomes a checkpoint, a way to confirm you're still who you're supposed to be. You think back to slavery and see how it intersects here. Enslaved bodies offer risk-free proof of dominance. No courtship, no rejection, no challenge. That access props up masculine confidence while eroding empathy. It's an ugly symmetry. Power feeds itself. As the day progresses, you hear about a feud sparked not by land but by insult. Someone implied another man had been used. The phrasing matters. The implication isn't about attraction, it's about submission. Scholars argue that same-sex acts may have occurred more frequently than the sources admit, but only the receptive role carried stigma. The act isn't the threat. The role is. You watch men police each other subtly. A hand pulled away too slowly, a joke deflected quickly. Emotional closeness is dangerous territory. Brotherhood exists, but it's armoured. Touch is functional, helping someone up, clapping a shoulder, not lingering. Sex is talked about loudly, intimacy is avoided. That contrast tells you everything. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Warrior culture rewarded aggression, but also demanded self-control. A man who couldn't regulate his desires, sexual or violent, was unreliable. Unreliability undermines group survival. Masculinity here isn't raw appetite, it's appetite under command. You notice how marriage affects this balance. A married man gains legitimacy. His sexuality becomes contained, predictable. Affairs risk destabilizing alliances, but they're tolerated if discreet. Getting caught isn't immoral, it's incompetent. Masculinity is as much about managing fallout as it is about action. As evening approaches, you sit near the fire again and hear a younger man being teased for his lack of experience. The teasing is sharp but corrective. He's expected to learn, to prove himself soon. Delay is suspicious. Sexual initiation is a milestone, not a personal journey. You feel the weight of expectation pressing forward in time. There's a moment when laughter turns cruel and someone steps in to redirect it. That intervention matters. Masculinity isn't chaos, it's regulated aggression. Someone always watches the temperature. Lose control, and you lose standing. You reflect on how little room there is for softness. Grief is permitted in bursts, then folded away. Desire is permitted when it aligns with dominance. Love, if it exists, is hidden behind practicality. This doesn't mean men don't feel deeply. It means feeling deeply is dangerous without armour. A scholarly debate echoes softly. Did this model of masculinity contribute to the violence that defines the Viking Age, or did it emerge as a response to already violent conditions? There's no clear answer. Culture and environment reinforce each other until cause and effect blur. Night settles in, and you lie down among men who snore, mutter, and shift in their sleep. Even here masculinity persists. No one curls inward too much. No one takes up too little space. Bodies assert presence even in rest. As sleep approaches, you realise how central masculinity is to everything you've observed. It shapes consent, marriage, slavery, insult, and law. Sex, for men here, is less about pleasure than proof. Proof that you belong, proof that you dominate, proof that you are not dominated. Tomorrow you'll turn the lens back toward women, not as complements to masculinity, but as actors navigating its demands, bending rules where they can. For now, you rest with the uneasy understanding that in the Viking Age, male sexuality is a performance staged under constant threat of collapse, and everyone in the audience is armed. You wake today with a quieter resolve in the air, as if resistance here doesn't announce itself, it adapts. After watching masculinity flex and fracture, you begin to see how women move within its shadow, not passively but strategically. This is not a story of equality, it's a story of manoeuvring, of finding leverage where none is supposed to exist. You notice it in small things first. A woman pauses before answering a question, letting silence do part of the work. Another redirects a conversation gently, steering it away from a dangerous topic. These aren't accidents. One historical fact anchors what you're seeing. Viking Age women, while legally and socially constrained, exercised influence through kinship networks, household management, and public reputation. Power here is often indirect, but that doesn't make it weak. You watch a wife oversee the distribution of food, correcting a younger man without raising her voice. He listens. That matters. Control of the household isn't ceremonial, it's economic. Whoever manages resources manages survival. Sex, marriage, and reproduction all feed into that system. A woman who understands it can protect herself and her children far more effectively than one who challenges it openly. There's a quiet calculation behind many interactions. When to speak, when to wait, when to involve male kin. Women learn early that solitary resistance is dangerous, but collective pressure, especially from family, can change outcomes. Scholars debate how often women successfully blocked unwanted marriages or sexual advances. The sources are thin, but the pattern suggests this. Protection increases with connections. Isolation is the real enemy. A quirky detail from saga literature floats up as you watch. Some women are described as sharp-tongued, capable of provoking men into actions that benefit their own families. Insults, when wielded carefully, become tools. Scholars argue whether this reflects admiration or anxiety about female influence. Probably both. Words are power when physical force is off limits. You see how women use reputation as armour. A woman known for propriety gains leverage. Accusing her carries risk. Gossip cuts both ways. This doesn't mean sexual restraint equals safety. Far from it. But it does mean perception matters. Women curate that perception actively. Modesty isn't always submission. Sometimes it's strategy. There's an open, scholarly debate that sits heavily here. Did Viking women experience their agency as empowerment, or simply as survival within oppression? Modern language struggles to hold that distinction. Watching these subtle negotiations, you suspect the answer depends on the moment. Agency can exist without justice. Skill doesn't imply fairness. You think back to divorce, mentioned earlier, and see it more clearly now. Divorce isn't romantic liberation, but it is leverage. The ability to leave, even at cost, changes the balance inside a marriage. A woman who can credibly threaten departure gains bargaining power. That doesn't erase violence or coercion, but it complicates them. The system cracks just enough to allow movement. You overhear a woman advising another quietly about timing, when to raise a concern, when to stay silent. Sex and pregnancy loom large in these calculations. A woman who produces heirs secures her position. One who doesn't may seek protection through alliances, fostering children, or aligning closely with her husband's kin. Desire is rarely centred. Security is. A fringe interpretation some scholars suggest feels uncomfortably apt. Women's sexual compliance may sometimes have been a calculated choice to preserve long-term stability. This idea risks sounding like justification, but it's meant as description. In a world where refusal can escalate violence, consent becomes complicated. Survival strategies aren't endorsements of the system, they're responses to it. You notice how women interact with concubines and enslaved women. The relationships are tense, layered, sometimes cruel, sometimes protective. Power trickles downward. A free woman may assert dominance over those beneath her even as she chafes under male authority. This doesn't negate her vulnerability. It reveals how hierarchy reproduces itself. Another historical fact settles in. Women often controlled keys to chests, storerooms, doors. Symbolically and practically, this mattered. Control of access is a form of power. Sex, resources, movement, all intersect here. A locked chest can mean withheld dowry. A closed door can delay a confrontation. Small acts accumulate. As the day unfolds, you hear a story about a woman who publicly shamed her husband into honouring an agreement. The laughter that follows is uneasy. She succeeded, but at a social cost. Clever women are admired and feared. Push too far and admiration curdles into accusation. Witchcraft, manipulation, unnatural ambition. The line is thin. You think about Cedar again, and how female practitioners occupy a strange space. Respected, marginal, dangerous. Sexual ambiguity clings to them in the stories. Scholars debate whether this reflects real ritual roles or male anxiety about women wielding unregulated power. Either way, sexuality and authority blur together uneasily. As evening approaches, you watch women gather children, settle disputes, prepare beds. This is labour, but it's also governance. Decisions made here ripple outward. Who sleeps where? Who eats first? Who is comforted? Sex doesn't happen in isolation from these choices. It's embedded in a network of care and control. There's a moment when a woman laughs freely, unguarded, and the sound carries. For a second, the system loosens. Then it tightens again as someone glances over. You feel how rare that freedom is, how quickly it's monitored. Joy exists, but it's careful. A scholarly debate hums softly beneath everything you've seen. If women were truly powerless, why do the sources spend so much time warning about them? Why fear sharp tongues, clever plots, seductive influence? Power that doesn't exist doesn't need policing. That doesn't mean women held equality. It means they mattered enough to be contained. Night settles again, and you lie among the familiar sounds. Somewhere intimacy unfolds, shaped by negotiation you'll never see. Consent here isn't pure, but neither is it absent. It's conditional, contextual, and often quiet. Women navigate a landscape designed without them in mind, and somehow still find paths through it. As sleep draws near, you understand that women's agency in the Viking Age isn't a triumph story or a tragedy alone. It's a practice, repeated daily, adjusted constantly. Sex is one of its sharpest tools and greatest risks. Tomorrow you'll step into territory even more fraught. Those desires that don't fit neatly into gender scripts at all, and how harshly they're judged. For now, you rest with the steady thought that survival here isn't about rebellion. It's about reading the room and knowing exactly when to move. You wake with a sense of narrowing corridors, paths that must be walked carefully because some directions simply don't exist in daylight. Today, you're stepping into what the sources barely speak aloud. Desires that fall outside approved patterns, not because they were rare, but because they were dangerous to name. In the Viking Age, queerness doesn't vanish. It hides, distorts, and returns as insult, fear, and myth. You notice first how language shifts. No one talks about attraction the way you might expect. There's no vocabulary for identity here, only for acts and roles. One historical fact anchors this immediately. Old Norse sources condemn certain sexual behaviours between men not as moral sins, but as violations of social hierarchy, specifically the act of being sexually penetrated. The concern isn't who you desire, it's who dominates. You sit near a conversation that skirts the edge of mockery. A man is accused of being ergi, a word heavy with implication. It suggests unmanliness, passivity, moral weakness. Scholars debate its exact meaning, but its power is clear. To be labelled this way is socially radioactive. The insult doesn't require proof. The accusation alone is enough to stain reputation. Here's a quirky but revealing detail. Calling another man ergi was serious enough to justify legal retaliation, including violence. This wasn't casual name-calling, it was an existential threat. That tells you everything about how deeply sexual roles were tied to honour. Desire isn't policed directly, submission is. You think back to masculinity and see how tightly this fits. A man who desires men but maintains dominance could theoretically escape stigma, if no one knew. A man perceived as receptive, regardless of desire, becomes a target. Scholars argue this suggests same-sex encounters were likely more common than the sources admit, as long as power hierarchies remained intact. Silence protects behaviour. Exposure destroys status. Women's same-sex desire is even harder to trace. The sources barely acknowledge it. Some later laws mention female-female sexual acts only briefly, often dismissively. Scholars debate whether this reflects ignorance, denial, or a belief that sex without penetration didn't count. Whatever the reason, the erasure itself is telling. Desire that doesn't threaten male dominance barely registers. Myth offers glimpses where reality stays quiet. Gods change shape, switch genders, cross boundaries freely. Loki gives birth. Odin practices Seder, a magic associated with femininity and sexual transgression. These stories fascinate and unsettle. An open scholarly debate lingers here. Do myths provide a safe outlet for taboo ideas, or do they reinforce boundaries by placing transgression firmly outside human norms? Watching how people react to these stories, you sense both. You notice nervous laughter when such myths are mentioned, amusement mixed with discomfort. The gods can cross lines because they aren't bound by human honour. Humans who try risk everything. That separation matters. It allows imagination without permission. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes raise feels plausible as you sit with this. Queerness in the Viking Age may have existed primarily as practice rather than identity. Without a framework to claim it openly, desire manifests in moments, not labels. This doesn't make it safer, it makes it lonelier. You think about enslaved people again. Their sexual lives are barely documented at all. Power complicates everything. An enslaved man subjected to sexual violence isn't described as dishonoured, he's invisible. Honour applies only to those allowed to possess it. That silence swallows entire experiences whole. As the day unfolds, you notice how tightly people guard behaviour. Physical closeness between men is brief, functional. Too much affection risks misinterpretation. Emotional intimacy is safer when masked as humour or rivalry. Desire finds no language here that doesn't also carry threat. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Christian writers later emphasise Scandinavian sexual deviance to contrast pagan disorder with Christian morality. Some accusations likely exaggerate, but exaggeration needs raw material. The outrage suggests behaviours that didn't fit neat categories, unsettling to observers who needed them to be. You overhear someone joke that everyone has urges. The laugh that follows is brittle. It acknowledges something without opening the door. Urges exist. Acting on them incorrectly does not end well. The line is drawn clearly even if what lies behind it is crowded. As evening approaches, you feel how this silence shapes lives. Desire that can't be named can't be negotiated. It can't be protected by law or kin. It exists only in risk. That risk might be thrilling for some, terrifying for others. Either way, it's isolating. You think about how identity itself is a luxury of safety. Without it, people still feel what they feel, but they experience it as personal failure or dangerous impulse. There's no community here for difference, only caution. A scholarly debate hums beneath all of this. Did Viking Age intolerance of certain sexual roles stem from moral belief or from fear of social instability? The evidence leans toward the latter. When power hierarchies are fragile, anything that blurs them becomes a threat. Sex is one of the fastest ways to blur lines. Night falls again, and you lie down among bodies that must be careful even in rest. Dreams at least are private. What happens there leaves no witnesses. That might be the only safe space desire ever truly has. As sleep takes hold, you understand that queerness in the Viking Age isn't absent, it's compressed, pushed into myth, insult, silence, and shadow. It exists, but without refuge. Tomorrow you'll see how those shadows are weaponized, how sexual accusations become tools of humiliation and feud. For now, you rest with the quiet, uneasy truth that in this world, to desire differently isn't a sin, it's a liability, and liabilities don't survive long without protection. You wake with the uneasy awareness that words here can wound as deeply as blades. Today, you begin to understand how sexuality becomes ammunition, how accusations, jokes, and whispers are sharpened into social weapons. In a world where honour is everything, shame is not a side effect. It's the point. You notice it almost immediately in casual conversation. Someone mentions another man's past with a smirk, just vague enough to avoid direct accusation. Laughter follows, but it's tight, careful. Everyone understands the rules. Say too much and you're responsible for what happens next. Say just enough, and the damage spreads on its own. One historical fact grounds the danger clearly. In Viking lore, certain sexual insults, especially accusations of passivity or unmanliness, were considered nid, a form of defamation so severe it could legally justify violence or killing. These weren't playground taunts, they were existential threats. To question a person's sexual honour was to question their right to exist socially. You hear the word again, ergi, dropped like a spark into dry grass. No one repeats it aloud, but everyone hears it. The insult doesn't need detail. It implies submission, weakness, inversion of the natural order. Scholars note that such insults were often more dangerous than accusations of theft or even murder. Those could be answered with proof. Sexual shame clings. A quirky detail from saga literature sharpens the picture. Some characters carve insulting symbols or verses into wood or stone, leaving permanent reminders of alleged sexual disgrace. These acts aren't spontaneous cruelty. They're strategic. Written shame travels further than spoken words. It lingers. It forces response. You watch the accused man's posture change. He straightens. His voice lowers. Silence stretches. Everyone waits to see what he'll do. Ignore it, and the rumour solidifies. Respond too aggressively, and he looks guilty. The trap is elegant and brutal. Sexual insult isn't about truth, it's about forcing action. There's an open scholarly debate that runs through this moment. Were sexual insults primarily moral judgments or political tools? Many historians argue they functioned as social warfare, ways to provoke feuds, undermine rivals, or justify violence without openly challenging power. Sitting here, it's hard to see them as anything else. Desire is irrelevant. Impact is everything. You think back to masculinity and understand this as its enforcement mechanism. The threat of humiliation keeps men in line more effectively than law. No one wants to be remembered as weak, penetrated, mocked. Death can be preferable to that legacy. The stories make that clear. Women too are targeted, though differently. Accusations of promiscuity, infidelity, or improper behaviour spread quickly and stick stubbornly. A woman's sexual reputation doesn't just affect her, it affects her kin. That's why families react so fiercely. Insult a woman, and you insult everyone connected to her. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes suggest feels plausible here. Sexual shaming may have functioned as a population control of sorts, discouraging behaviours that threatened inheritance clarity or alliance stability. Whether intentional or not, the effect is the same. Fear keeps desire predictable. You notice how carefully people choose their words now. Conversations become clipped, humour retreats, everyone is calculating risk. This is what shame does. It narrows possibility. It keeps people inside approved lanes not because they believe in them, but because the alternative is social annihilation. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Insults weren't just personal, they could be inherited. A family marked by sexual disgrace might struggle for generations to recover status. Memory here is long, and stories are retold with purpose. Shame is a legacy. You think about queerness again and see how this system erases it without ever naming it. When accusation equals death, silence becomes survival. Desire that doesn't fit is forced underground, where it can be exploited later by enemies. The closet here isn't private, it's a trapdoor. As the day wears on, you hear of a feud sparked years ago by a single insult spoken at a feast. The original words barely matter anymore. What matters is that they couldn't be taken back. Sex, in this context, isn't intimate. It's rhetorical. It's a way to say, you don't belong among us. You notice how law hovers in the background, almost irrelevant. Yes, there are rules about defamation. Yes, there are fines. But once shame spreads, law can't contain it. Violence becomes the language of resolution because violence is visible. It restores honour in a way apologies never can. As evening approaches, you sit near the fire and listen to stories told with exaggerated caution. No one names names. No one repeats the insult. Everyone knows better now. The damage is done. Silence descends not because the threat has passed, but because it's been understood. You realise how exhausting this constant vigilance must be. Every word weighed, every joke filtered. Desire monitored not for morality, but for vulnerability. This isn't repression in the modern sense. It's survival in a high-stakes social game. A scholarly debate hums beneath the crackenture of the fire. Did this culture of sexual shaming create violence, or simply channel it? The answer feels circular. Shame provokes violence. Violence reinforces shame. The system feeds itself. Night settles in, and you lie down with the familiar press of bodies nearby. Somewhere, someone lies awake replaying a moment, a word, a glance, wondering if it will be used against them tomorrow. Sex here doesn't end when the act ends. It lingers in language, in memory, in threat. As sleep finally comes, you understand that in the Viking Age, sexual shame is not about desire gone wrong. It's about power asserting itself through humiliation. Tomorrow, you'll see how that power extends into magic, fear, and the blurred boundaries between sex and sorcery. For now, you rest with the uneasy certainty that in this world, words about sex don't just describe, they destroy. You wake with the lingering sense that the world here doesn't end at what you can see. After insults and law, the lines blur today between sex and something far less tangible. Magic, fear, and the suspicion that desire itself might bend reality. In the Viking Age, sexuality doesn't just threaten social order, it threatens the unseen. You notice how people lower their voices when certain topics come up. Names aren't spoken casually, gestures matter. Someone makes a small sign with their fingers before entering a space, half habit, half precaution. One historical fact anchors this unease. Seder, a form of Norse magic associated with prophecy, fate, and manipulation, was deeply entwined with ideas of sexual transgression and gender deviance. You hear it said plainly for the first time, Seder is dangerous, not because it doesn't work, but because of who practices it and how. Women are most often associated with it, though not exclusively. Men who practice it are feared and ridiculed in equal measure. The accusation isn't that the magic fails, it's that it feminizes, corrupts, unmans. A quirky detail from the sources settles into your thoughts. Practicing Seder as a man could invite accusations of sexual passivity, even queerness, regardless of one's actual desires. Scholars argue whether this reflects real ritual behaviour or social anxiety about men stepping outside dominant roles. Either way, magic and sex are bound together through the language of shame. You sit near someone recounting a story of a woman who stole a man's strength through spells. The imagery is unmistakably sexual, draining, binding, entangling. Desire here is not just physical, it's extractive. Sex becomes a metaphor for power taken without consent. That fear says more about the society than the spell. There's an open scholarly debate that circles this moment. Was Seder genuinely sexualized in practice, or was sexuality imposed onto it by later Christian writers and anxious contemporaries? Some descriptions suggest ecstatic rituals, altered states, possibly involving touch or symbolic penetration. Others argue these are projections meant to discredit pagan practices. The truth is frustratingly unclear. The association, however, is undeniable. You think back to gender expectations and see how neatly this fits. Female sexuality already unsettles male authority, adds supernatural influence, and it becomes terrifying. A woman who can see fate, alter outcomes, or influence desire threatens not just individuals but the structure itself. Magic becomes the language used to explain power that can't be controlled. You notice how accusations work here. A woman who is too assertive, too knowledgeable, too sexually autonomous may find herself whispered about. Not openly condemned, just edged towards suspicion. Witchcraft isn't yet the formalized crime it will become centuries later, but the groundwork is visible. Sexual nonconformity and magical fear travel together. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes raise floats through your mind. Seda may have offered women a socially recognized space to exert influence precisely because it was framed as dangerous and marginal. Power wrapped in fear is still power, but it's a power that comes at a cost. Respect mixed with isolation. You hear someone mention Odin, the chief god, and how even he practiced Seda despite its stigma. This complicates everything. Odin crosses boundaries constantly. Gendered, moral, cosmic. Scholars debate whether this myth legitimizes transgression or confines it to the divine. Watching how people talk about it, you sense admiration layered with discomfort. Gods can afford contradictions. Humans cannot. You think again about sex as accusation, sex as shame. Magic becomes another way to frame sexual anxiety. If desire causes disruption, perhaps it's because someone willed it. Seduction turns into sorcery. Attraction becomes attack. This reframing protects the idea of order by externalizing blame. Another historical fact settles quietly. Norse love charms and fertility spells are attested in later folklore, suggesting long-standing traditions linking sexuality with enchantment. Whether these practices were widespread or symbolic is debated, but the belief in their possibility mattered. Belief shapes behavior as surely as truth. As the day goes on, you notice how men react to women rumored to practice magic. There's caution, even deference. Jokes stop short. Insults soften. Fear tempers dominance. This isn't equality, but it is a shift. Sexual power, when combined with perceived supernatural power, changes the equation. You also notice how men accused of magical practice fare differently. Ridicule comes first, then distancing, then sometimes violence. A man who blurs gendered boundaries through magic threatens the hierarchy from within. He becomes a living insult, like those you heard yesterday, only harder to erase. There's a moment when someone mentions a spell meant to cause impotence. Laughter follows, but it's strained. Sexual failure is already terrifying. Magical sexual failure is unbearable. The idea that desire and performance could be stolen reinforces anxiety already present in masculine identity. As evening approaches, you feel how sex, magic, and fear create a closed loop. Desire disrupts order. Disruption demands explanation. Magic provides one. That explanation then polices behavior, pushing people back into approved roles. The system reinforces itself through story and suspicion. You sit near the fire as darkness gathers, and someone tells a story meant to warn, not entertain. A woman who used her beauty and spells to ruin a household. A man who sought forbidden knowledge and paid with his reputation. These stories aren't about truth. They're about boundaries. A scholarly debate hums beneath the crackle of flames. Were magical accusations tools to control sexuality, especially female sexuality, or genuine expressions of belief in a dangerous unseen world? As always, the answer feels like both. Control often wears the mask of belief. You realize how little space there is here for innocent desire. Sex is always doing something, producing heirs, forging alliances, inviting shame, provoking magic. Pleasure exists, but it's overshadowed by consequence. Even the supernatural reflects that anxiety. As you lie down once more, you feel the weight of invisible forces pressing close. Not ghosts or gods exactly, but expectations, fears, stories told long enough to feel real. Tomorrow you'll come back down to earth, to herbs, charms, and the desperate attempts people make to manage fertility itself. For now, you drift towards sleep with the uneasy understanding that in the Viking Age, sex doesn't just shape society, it shapes the cosmos. and anything that powerful is always feared. You wake today with a quieter urgency, the kind that doesn't come from fear of insult or magic, but from the body itself. Fertility looms over everything you've seen so far, and now you step into the realm where people try, sometimes desperately, to control it. Not through law, not through honour, but through herbs, whispers, and half-remembered knowledge passed hand to hand. You notice how conversations about pregnancy happen sideways. No one announces intentions directly. Instead, there are comments about timing, about health, about whether now is a good season. One historical fact grounds this uncertainty. Viking Age people lacked formal medical understanding of reproduction, relying instead on folk knowledge, herbal remedies, and ritual practices to influence fertility and prevent or encourage pregnancy. You sit near two women working with bundles of dried plants. They don't explain what they're doing, but the care is obvious. Some herbs are for easing childbirth, some for encouraging conception, some, quietly, carefully, for preventing it. This isn't ignorance, it's experimentation accumulated over generations. What works stays. What kills you disappears from memory. A quirky detail surfaces from later Scandinavian folklore. Plants like angelica, mugwort, and juniper were believed to influence fertility, menstruation, and sexual desire. Scholars debate how far back these beliefs go, but the continuity is striking. People here may not understand hormones, but they understand patterns. Bodies respond to something. That's enough to keep trying. You think about who needs this knowledge most. Women whose lives hinge on pregnancy. Too many children mean exhaustion, danger, loss. Too few mean suspicion, instability, abandonment. Fertility isn't a blessing or a curse. It's a calculation. Managing it quietly can be the difference between survival and disaster. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath this moment. Did Viking Age women possess effective methods of birth control, or are modern historians projecting later folk practices backward? Some argue that herbal abortifacients and contraceptives were known but dangerous. Others suggest most attempts were unreliable at best. Watching the seriousness with which these plants are handled, you sense that even partial control would be worth the risk. You notice how men are largely absent from these conversations. Fertility is framed as a woman's responsibility, regardless of biology. If pregnancy happens, she's blamed or praised. If it doesn't, she's scrutinized. Sex may involve two people, but reproduction accountability rarely does. A fringe belief floats through your mind. Some charms were thought to work not by physical means, but by deception, tricking spirits, fate, or even the body itself. Words spoken during sex, knots tied afterward, objects hidden under bedding. Scholars debate whether these were symbolic comforts or genuinely believed interventions. In a world this uncertain, the line barely matters. Belief itself changes behaviour. You watch someone discreetly hand another a small pouch. No explanation, no witnesses. This is how sensitive knowledge travels. Written records would be dangerous. Oral transmission keeps control localised. If something goes wrong, blame doesn't spread far. Another historical fact settles in quietly. High maternal mortality rates made childbirth one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. This alone reshapes how you view fertility control. Wanting fewer pregnancies isn't rebellion, it's pragmatism. Every birth is a gamble with death. You think back to slavery and concubinage and realise how uneven access to fertility control must have been. An enslaved woman's pregnancy benefits her owner, not herself. Knowledge, even when it exists, isn't always usable. Control requires power. Without it, the body becomes territory others manage. As the day unfolds, you hear whispers about a woman who knew too much. The phrasing is vague but loaded. Knowledge that interferes with reproduction can be seen as threatening. Scholars argue that later witchcraft accusations may have roots in this fear. Women who could control fertility controlled lineage. That's never neutral. You also hear about charms meant to increase desire, to encourage a reluctant partner, to rekindle interest. These aren't framed as coercive, they're framed as necessary. Sex within marriage is expected. If it falters, the solution isn't conversation, it's intervention. Magic, herbs, ritual, all blend into a single toolkit. A scholarly debate surfaces here too. Where does medicine end and magic begin? In the Viking Age, the distinction barely exists. What matters is effect. If a plant works, it works. If a charm calms anxiety, that matters. Modern categories don't fit cleanly here. You notice how fertility knowledge reinforces gender roles even as it empowers. Women become guardians of reproduction, but also scapegoats. Men benefit from heirs without bearing physical risk. The imbalance is stark even when women hold the knowledge. As evening approaches, someone tells a cautionary story about a potion taken at the wrong time. The moral isn't about disobedience, it's about precision. Timing matters. Bodies are seasonal here, like crops. Sex is tied to cycles, of land, of moon, of blood. Fertility control isn't about stopping nature, it's about negotiating with it. You feel how exhausting that must be. Constant vigilance, constant calculation. Desire doesn't get to be spontaneous when consequences are this high. Even pleasure is shadowed by outcome. Will this lead to pregnancy? Is that good? Is it safe? Another quirky detail settles in. Some sources suggest that breastfeeding was believed to delay fertility, and women used extended nursing as a natural spacing method. Scholars debate how intentional this was, but the practice fits the pattern. Bodies learn, knowledge adapts. You sit near the fire again, watching shadows move across the walls. Someone rubs herbs between their fingers, releasing a sharp scent. The air feels thick with intention. Sex, fertility, survival. They're inseparable here. Every act carries a future. As night deepens, you realize how fertility control complicates everything you've learned. It shows desire pushing back against destiny, however slightly. It shows agency operating in margins, in whispers, in risk. It doesn't overthrow the system. It navigates it. Tomorrow you'll follow the consequences of fertility forward, into pregnancy, childbirth, and the terrifying gamble of bringing new life into a world this hard. For now, you drift towards sleep with the steady understanding that in the Viking Age, even trying to control sex's outcomes is an act of quiet defiance. You wake with a heaviness that settles low in the body, because today the consequences of everything you've seen become unavoidable. Sex leads here, again and again, to pregnancy, to birth, to a moment where survival narrows to a single body on a bed of straw. There's no romance attached to it, just risk, hope, and a community holding its breath. You notice immediately how pregnancy changes the air around a woman. She's watched more closely, spoken to more carefully, given advice whether she asks for it or not. One historical fact grounds this tension. Childbirth in the Viking Age was extremely dangerous, with high maternal and infant mortality rates due to infection, hemorrhage, and lack of surgical knowledge. Everyone here knows someone who didn't survive it. You sit near the fire as an older woman inspects a pregnant belly with practiced hands. This isn't superstition alone. Experience matters. Women who have survived multiple births carry authority that no law code grants. Their knowledge isn't written, but it's trusted. When they speak, others listen. A quirky detail surfaces from later saga references. Birthing stools were sometimes used, allowing women to give birth upright rather than lying down. Scholars debate how widespread this was, but the idea itself suggests practical experimentation rather than blind tradition. Comfort, however limited, was pursued where possible. You feel how pregnancy narrows a woman's options. Her body becomes public property in a new way. Advice, concern, suspicion, all gather around her. Is she eating enough? Working too hard? Carrying the child correctly? Fertility once admired becomes vulnerability. Sex is no longer about alliance or desire. It's about outcome, now visible and inescapable. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath this moment. How much emotional attachment existed between parents and infants in a world where so many children died young? Some historians argue emotional distance was a coping mechanism. Others point to grave goods, naming practices and mourning rituals as evidence of deep attachment despite the risk. Watching how gently people treat this pregnant woman, it's hard to believe indifference ever fully set in. You hear quiet references to fate, to the Norns, to threads being spun whether anyone likes it or not. Pregnancy is framed as destiny, but that doesn't make it passive. Women prepare carefully, herbs are gathered, amulets are tied near the bed. The unseen is negotiated with as seriously as the physical. As labour begins, the atmosphere tightens, men withdraw. This is women's territory now. One historical fact stands out sharply. childbirth was almost exclusively managed by women, with men often barred from the space entirely. Birth is communal, but gendered. Masculine authority stops at the threshold. You sit just outside the birthing space listening. The sounds aren't cinematic, they're raw. Breathing, commands, encouragement, pain unsoftened by anesthetic or illusion. This is where sex leads when it succeeds, and it's terrifying. Everyone here knows that. A fringe belief floats through your thoughts. Some scholars suggest that birthing rituals may have included symbolic acts meant to open the body, untying knots, opening doors, loosening hair. These gestures don't cure hemorrhage or infection, but they create a sense of motion, of helping the body along. When control is limited, symbolism becomes support. Time stretches. Someone mutters a prayer that isn't Christian yet. Someone else paces. The labouring woman's cries rise and fall, and with them the collective anxiety. Pregnancy might be expected. Birth is never routine. When the child finally arrives, there's no immediate celebration. First, the mother must survive. That pause matters. Only after she breathes steadily does relief ripple outward. Then attention turns to the infant. Alive, crying, fragile. Survival is confirmed in stages. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Newborns were not always immediately accepted into the household. Naming ceremonies and rituals could occur days later, marking the child's formal entry into the family. Scholars debate whether this delay reflects emotional caution or ritual necessity. Likely both. Hope is dangerous until it's earned. You notice how quickly responsibility shifts back onto the woman. Recovery is expected, even if it's slow. There's little room for prolonged rest. The household needs labour. The child needs care. Pain is acknowledged but not indulged. Endurance is praised more than comfort. You think back to fertility control and realise how rational it was. Every pregnancy risks leaving children motherless. Every birth reshuffles the household stability. Sex that produces life also courts death. That duality never disappears here. You also notice the unevenness again. An enslaved woman's childbirth is quieter, less attended. Her survival matters, but differently. The child's future is determined immediately by status. There's no ceremony to negotiate fate. Fate is assigned. A scholarly debate hums beneath the exhaustion. Were women revered for their reproductive role, or trapped by it? The answer resists simplicity. Reverence doesn't equal safety. Importance doesn't equal autonomy. Pregnancy grants attention, not protection. As the day fades into evening, the new mother sleeps fitfully. The child is wrapped and placed nearby. Someone keeps watch. Not out of sentimentality, but because the first nights are dangerous. Fever, bleeding, sudden silence. Survival isn't secured yet. You sit near the fire again, thinking about how casually sex began this journey. A shared bed, a moment of obligation, a calculation. And now here, blood, breath, uncertainty. The distance between act and consequence feels enormous, yet unavoidable. A quirky detail surfaces as someone mentions an old belief that a woman who survives many births carries luck, that her presence can ease others' labour. Survivors become talismans. Experience becomes almost magical in a world this precarious. As night settles, you feel the exhaustion ripple through the household. Life continues because it has to. The child may or may not live. The mother may or may not fully recover. No one can know yet. Certainty doesn't exist here, only vigilance. You lie down once more among familiar sounds, aware that this is what sex ultimately feeds into. A gamble played with bodies and futures. Tomorrow, you'll see how failure, betrayal, and desire outside these reproductive boundaries are punished when things go wrong. For now, you drift towards sleep with the sobering truth that in the Viking Age, bringing life into the world is not a miracle moment. It's a negotiated survival, and everyone involved knows exactly how much is at stake. You wake to tension that hasn't cooled overnight. It lingers in glances, in the way voices stay just a little too even. Today, you step into the aftermath. What happens when sex breaks its expected boundaries? Infidelity here isn't just betrayal, it's disruption, and disruption demands response. You notice how carefully people watch each other. A married man speaks too closely to someone not his wife. A woman laughs too freely at the wrong joke. These moments don't pass unnoticed. One historical fact anchors the risk. Viking Age law codes treated adultery as a serious offence, especially for women, because it threatened lineage certainty and household stability. Sex outside approved channels isn't private misbehaviour, it's a public hazard. You hear about a dispute unfolding quietly but urgently. A husband suspects his wife. No proof yet, just pattern, absence, rumour. That's enough to start calculations. Who saw what? Who might testify? Who benefits if this accusation sticks? Infidelity cases don't belong to the couple alone. They belong to families, allies, enemies waiting for leverage. A quirky detail from saga literature surfaces as you listen. Adulterous affairs are often revealed not by confession, but by objects, forgotten jewellery, misplaced weapons, bedsheets noticed too closely. Scholars debate whether this reflects reality or narrative drama. Either way, it underscores something important. Sex leaves traces, and those traces become evidence. You feel how uneven the consequences are. A man's affair might provoke anger, fines, or violence if it insults another powerful man. A woman's affair, once confirmed, can cost her marriage, her children, even her life. The imbalance isn't hidden, it's built in. Fidelity is demanded most fiercely where control matters most. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath this moment. Were Viking punishments for adultery as brutal as later Christian moralists claimed, or have the sources exaggerated? Some evidence suggests negotiated settlements and divorces were more common than executions. Others point to saga accounts of honour killings. Sitting here, you realise both can be true. Outcomes depend on status, support and timing. You watch how anger is managed. No one explodes immediately. That would be reckless. First comes consultation. Kin are informed. Allies weighed. Violence here is rarely impulsive. It's justified. Sex becomes the spark, but honour provides the fuel. A fringe interpretation some historians suggest feels chillingly plausible. Accusations of infidelity were sometimes less about sexual betrayal and more about redistributing power. Ending a marriage could realign alliances. Killing a rival could erase debts. Sex becomes the excuse that makes drastic change acceptable. You think back to consent and realise how little it matters here. Even if an affair began willingly, the law and community don't care about feelings. They care about outcomes. Who was wronged? Who lost face? Who must be compensated or eliminated to restore balance? You overhear a story of a man who caught his wife with another. The retelling focuses not on pain, but on decisiveness. He acted quickly. That's what earns approval. Hesitation suggests weakness. Masculinity again demands response. Sexual betrayal tests it publicly. Another historical fact settles in quietly. In some regions, a husband had the legal right to kill his wife and her lover if caught in the act. Scholars debate how often this occurred in practice. Even if rare, the possibility shapes behaviour. Fear enforces fidelity more effectively than love ever could. You notice how women prepare for this reality. Confidants matter. Alibis matter. Silence matters. Affairs, if they happen, are navigated with extreme caution. This isn't romance, it's espionage. One mistake can ripple outward into violence that consumes entire families. As the day wears on, you hear about punishment that doesn't involve death, public shaming, divorce with loss of property, children reassigned to paternal kin. These outcomes don't make good saga drama, but they're devastating in quieter ways. Survival doesn't always mean victory. A scholarly debate echoes here too. Did strict punishment of infidelity actually reduce it, or simply push it underground? Evidence suggests the latter. Desire doesn't disappear because it's dangerous, it becomes strategic. That strategy in turn creates paranoia. You notice how servants and enslaved people are treated in these cases. If involved with a free person's spouse, they absorb disproportionate blame. Their bodies are expendable. Punishment reinforces hierarchy under the guise of morality. Sex once again reveals who counts. As evening approaches, tension either resolves or hardens. A settlement is reached, compensation agreed upon, or violence looms, postponed but inevitable. Sex sets the timeline, but honour decides the end. You sit near the fire as someone sharpens a blade a little too carefully. No one comments. Everyone understands what might be coming. This is how betrayal echoes outward, turning intimacy into conflict. A quirky detail slips into your thoughts. Some sagas describe prophetic dreams preceding acts of revenge for adultery. Scholars argue whether this is literary foreshadowing or genuine belief. Either way, it frames punishment as fate rather than choice. Responsibility is softened by destiny. You realize how exhausting this vigilance must be. Desire constantly weighed against consequence, every attraction a potential catastrophe. Sex here isn't forbidden, it's dangerous, and danger requires constant management. As night settles again, you lie down aware that somewhere nearby, someone is deciding whether to forgive, divorce, or kill. Sex has already happened. What matters now is restoring order. Tomorrow you'll see the other side of this coin, how relationships end not through violence, but through formal separation, and what freedom and loss look like when divorce is possible but costly. For now, you drift towards sleep with the steady realization that in the Viking Age, infidelity isn't about broken hearts, it's about broken structures, and structures, once cracked, demand repair in blood, silver, or silence. You wake into a quieter aftermath today, the kind that follows conflict when no one quite knows what comes next. Where yesterday hovered on the edge of violence, today turns towards something more procedural, but no less heavy: divorce and separation. In the Viking Age, endings are possible, but they are never clean. You notice how the word itself isn't spoken dramatically. Separation is discussed the way one might discuss moving livestock or reallocating land: practical, measured. One historical fact anchors the moment clearly. Viking law allowed for divorce under specific conditions, and women as well as men could initiate it, provided the process followed strict public rituals. That alone sets this world apart from many later medieval societies, but the cost of that freedom is steep. You listen as someone explains the steps quietly. Witnesses must be present. Statements must be made aloud, often at a doorway or assembly. Words must be exact. Divorce isn't a private decision. It's a performance designed to prevent denial later. If sex and marriage are public concerns, so is their dissolution. A quirky detail from the law code sticks with you. In some regions, a woman could initiate divorce by formally declaring it 3 times, each in a different place: at the household doorway, at the bed, and at a public assembly. Scholars debate how often this happened in practice, but the symbolism matters. The spaces of intimacy become the spaces of separation. You feel the weight of what's being undone. A marriage isn't just 2 people, it's land, children, alliances, labour. Ending it doesn't simply free anyone, it rearranges obligations. Property must be divided, children assigned, usually to the father's kin. A woman may regain her dowry, but security is not guaranteed. Divorce opens a door and drops you into uncertainty. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath this process. Did the ability to divorce meaningfully protect women, or did it primarily serve elite interests by allowing strategic realignments? Some historians argue divorce empowered women to escape abuse or neglect. Others point out that post-divorce life could be harsher than marriage itself. Watching how carefully people weigh the decision, you suspect both interpretations are true. You notice how divorce is often framed as failure, not liberation. Not moral failure, functional failure. The marriage didn't produce harmony, heirs, or stability. Sex here is implicated quietly. Too little of it. Too much elsewhere. Infertility. Betrayal. Desire becomes evidence after the fact, reshaped to justify separation. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes raise flickers in your mind. Divorce may have acted as a pressure release in a rigid system, allowing conflict to dissipate without constant bloodshed. That doesn't make it gentle, it makes it necessary. Order survives because endings are permitted. You watch a woman pack her belongings. The items are modest but chosen carefully. Tools, clothing, tokens from her birth family. Each object signals where she'll go next. Divorce doesn't send her into independence. It sends her back into another network. Kin, service, remarriage. Autonomy here is relational, not individual. Men too bear consequences. A divorced man loses face, especially if the separation suggests he failed to control his household or satisfy expectations. Remarriage is possible, but reputation lingers. Sex again is central, not as pleasure, but as proof of competence. A man left by his wife is scrutinized. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Remarriage was common, especially among elites, often soon after divorce or death. Emotional recovery isn't prioritized. Stability is. Sex becomes instrumental again, restarting cycles you've already seen. Negotiation, obligation, fertility. You notice how children are discussed. Rarely with sentiment, mostly with logistics. Who feeds them? Who claims them? Love is assumed but unspoken. Inheritance is explicit. A child's placement determines future alliances. Divorce reshapes the next generation before they have any say. As the day unfolds, you hear someone remark that peace was better this way. That phrase lingers. Peace isn't happiness, it's absence of escalation. Divorce, like law, exists to prevent feuds. It absorbs tension that might otherwise explode. Sex, when it destabilizes too much, is removed from the equation by removing the bond itself. A scholarly debate echoes softly. Did the possibility of divorce encourage marital cruelty, knowing an exit existed, or did it restrain cruelty by offering alternatives to violence? The sources don't answer cleanly. They show both endurance and abandonment, often side by side. You think back to women's agency and see divorce as one of its sharpest tools and bluntest. It can cut you free, but it can also wound deeply. The law offers structure, not comfort. It acknowledges conflict without resolving pain. As evening approaches, you see the separated individuals settle into new arrangements almost immediately. There's little time for reflection. Labour demands continue. Desire doesn't pause for grief. Life here is too precarious for long emotional interludes. A quirky detail surfaces from saga patterns. Divorced women are sometimes portrayed as sharper, more guarded, less idealistic. Scholars argue whether this reflects misogyny or observation. Either way, experience hardens expectations. Sex after divorce is approached cautiously, as risk management rather than hope. You sit near the fire again, watching the space where a couple once sat together now occupied by two others. Absence is quickly filled. That's how systems survive. Individuals are interchangeable in ways that feel unsettling. You realize how divorce completes the circuit you've been tracing. Sex leads to marriage, marriage to reproduction. Failure leads to separation. Separation loops back into negotiation. The system adapts without apology. As night settles, you lie down aware that tomorrow may bring new unions already in motion. Desire doesn't wait for closure. It's folded into logistics as efficiently as everything else. Tomorrow you'll turn to aging, how desire, status, and sexual value shift over a lifetime in a culture this practical. For now, you rest with the understanding that in the Viking Age, endings are allowed, but only if they preserve the larger order. Freedom exists here, but it's heavy, conditional, and never free of consequence. You wake today with a slower rhythm in the air, as if time itself has begun to lean forward. Desire here doesn't disappear with age, but it changes shape, value, and consequence. In a culture obsessed with productivity and survival, aging alters how bodies are read, how sex is expected, and how much power desire is allowed to hold. You notice it first in posture. Older men move with authority rather than force. Younger men defer, not because they're weaker, but because age signals accumulated success. One historical fact grounds this shift clearly. In Viking Age society, age often conferred status, especially for men who had survived long enough to accumulate land, kin, and reputation. Sexual value follows that status rather than youth alone. An older man speaks and others listen. His virility is assumed, not proven. No one jokes about his performance. His sexual history is part of his authority, not a liability. Affairs, if they exist, are discreet and rarely challenged. Desire, here, has become quiet entitlement rather than risky display. A quirky detail from saga tradition surfaces in your mind. Older men are sometimes described taking younger wives without commentary, as if the imbalance requires no explanation. Scholars debate whether this reflects demographic reality, short lifespans and widowhood, or narrative normalization of male dominance. Either way, age amplifies male sexual power rather than diminishing it. You watch how differently women age. Youth grants attention, fertility grants respect, age grants ambiguity. An older woman who has borne children and managed a household can command real authority. Her voice carries weight. But a woman without those markers, widowed, childless, divorced, can slide into invisibility. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath this observation. Were post-reproductive women freer or more constrained? Some historians argue menopause released women from the risks of pregnancy and increased autonomy. Others point out that sexual relevance was tightly bound to fertility, and once that faded, so did social value. Watching who speaks and who is ignored, you sense that both can be true at once. You notice how older women often cluster together, sharing knowledge, childcare, ritual roles. Their sexuality is rarely discussed, not because it doesn't exist, but because it no longer serves lineage directly. Sex without reproductive consequence becomes socially quieter. That silence can feel like relief, or erasure. A fringe interpretation some scholars suggest drifts through your thoughts. Older women may have wielded influence precisely because they were perceived as sexually neutral, less threatening. This neutrality grants access. You've seen it already. Older women moving freely between spaces, advising without provoking anxiety. Desire still exists, but it's no longer the lens through which they're judged. You think back to fertility control and childbirth, and realise how much danger aging removes. An older woman's body is no longer a battleground for lineage. That safety shifts relationships. Sexual refusal becomes less risky. Expectations soften. Survival recalibrates. Men, however, are not released so easily. Aging men must balance authority with restraint. A man who pursues sex too openly in old age risks ridicule. Desire must be dignified. Younger partners are acceptable if framed as alliance or stability. Lust for its own sake becomes unbecoming. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Sagas often mock old men who behave like young warriors, chasing glory or desire without restraint. Age demands composure. Sexual excess in old age signals loss of control rather than potency. Masculinity evolves from dominance to governance. You notice how remarriage patterns reflect this. Older widowers often remarry quickly, seeking household continuity. Older widows may remarry strategically, or not at all. Choice increases with age for some, but only if they've survived with reputation intact. Age rewards success, not survival alone. You hear a story about an elderly woman known for her sharp memory and sharper advice. People laugh affectionately. There's respect there. Her sexual history is irrelevant now. What matters is what she remembers. Who wronged whom? Which alliances failed? Which children belong where? Knowledge outlives desire. A scholarly debate echoes beneath this moment. Did aging soften Viking sexual norms, or simply move them out of view? The sources favour youth because youth drives drama. Older sexuality doesn't vanish, it just stops generating conflict worth recording. You think about enslaved people again, and notice how aging offers them almost nothing. An older enslaved body loses value quickly. Sexual exploitation may decrease, but so does protection. Age here is not wisdom, it's depreciation. Status always overrides years lived. As the day unfolds, you feel how aging reveals the system's priorities. Sex matters most when it produces heirs, disrupts order, or proves dominance. When it does none of those things, it fades into background noise. Pleasure without consequence doesn't command attention. You watch an older couple sit together in silence, sharing food without touching. There's comfort there, but it's unremarked. No one celebrates it. Stability isn't exciting, it's expected. The system doesn't reward quiet endurance with praise. It rewards it by letting it continue. A quirky detail surfaces from burial practices. Older individuals are sometimes buried with symbols of authority rather than sexuality. Keys, tools, weapons. Scholars debate interpretation, but the pattern fits what you see. Identity solidifies over time. Sex is only one chapter, not the conclusion. As evening approaches, you realize how much fear fades with age. Fear of insult, of failure, of pregnancy, of exposure. But that relief comes at the cost of visibility. Desire is safest when it no longer matters. You sit near the fire again, watching flames settle into embers. Younger bodies still carry the weight of expectation you've seen so clearly. Older ones carry memory instead. Sex doesn't define them anymore. Survival does. A scholarly debate hums softly. Did Viking culture honour elders for wisdom, or merely tolerate them once usefulness was proven? The answer feels uneven. Honour must be earned repeatedly. Aging alone doesn't guarantee it. As night falls, you lie down aware that time is the one force even this rigid system can't fully control. Bodies age, desire shifts, power migrates, sex, once so dangerous, becomes quieter, not because it loses meaning, but because its meaning has already been decided. Tomorrow you'll feel another shift, when Christianity arrives, bringing new moral language that collides with everything you've witnessed. For now, you rest with the understanding that in the Viking Age, aging doesn't free desire, it reframes it, and what no longer threatens order is allowed to exist quietly, at last. You wake to a feeling of intrusion, like a draft cutting through a familiar room. Something new is arriving, and it doesn't ask permission. It comes with words, heavy ones, about purity, sin, and salvation. Christianity is no longer a distant rumour carried by traders. It's here now, brushing up against old customs, and nowhere does that friction spark more uneasily than around sex. You notice it first in language. People still speak the old way, but certain acts are suddenly described with hesitation. Not illegal yet, not forbidden outright, just questionable. One historical fact anchors this shift clearly. Christianity began spreading through Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries, overlapping with the late Viking Age and gradually reshaping laws, rituals and moral frameworks, including those governing sexuality. You sit near a conversation where someone mentions a new kind of priest. The tone is skeptical but curious. These men speak of one God, one marriage, one acceptable path for desire. That alone is radical. Everything you've seen so far depends on flexibility, concubinage, divorce, negotiated consent, hierarchy-based morality. Christianity offers something rigid in its place. A quirky detail surfaces as you listen. Early Christian missionaries often focused their preaching on sexual behaviour, condemning practices like concubinage, polygamy, and ritual sexuality before addressing violence or slavery. Scholars debate why. Some argue sex was the most visible marker of difference. Others suggest controlling sex was the fastest way to control family structure. Sitting here, it feels like both. You watch how people react, not with outrage, but with selective interest. The promise of eternal life is abstract. The promise of sexual regulation is immediate. Telling a powerful man to abandon concubines challenges his status. Telling a woman her sexuality is sinful challenges her strategies for survival. The resistance isn't loud, it's practical. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath this moment. Did Christianity liberate Viking women by restricting male sexual access? Or did it ultimately tighten control over female bodies by reframing sex as moral failure? Early on, the effects are uneven. Limiting concubinage could reduce exploitation. Condemning divorce could trap women in harmful marriages. The trade-offs are immediate and messy. You hear someone scoff at the idea that sex could be sinful even within marriage. Pleasure, according to these new teachings, is suspect unless tightly bound to reproduction. This is new. In the old worldview, sex was dangerous, yes, but not dirty. Christianity brings shame into places where there was once only consequence. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes suggest feels strikingly plausible here. Christianity didn't replace Viking sexual norms so much as it reorganized them, shifting power from kin-based negotiation to institutional authority. What was once handled by families, assemblies, and reputation begins moving toward priests, confessions, and doctrine. Control centralizes. You notice how quickly certain practices are reframed. Fertility rituals become superstition. Cider becomes demonic. Sexual insults gain moral weight rather than social meaning. Words change, and with them, consequences. The same act can suddenly mean something entirely different, not just disruptive, but sinful. Another historical fact settles quietly. Early Christian law codes in Scandinavia still tolerated many traditional practices, gradually phasing them out rather than banning them outright. This isn't a clean break, it's a long negotiation. People hedge their bets, attending church while maintaining old habits at home. Sex lives in that contradiction. You think back to fertility control and childbirth and see how Christian influence complicates them. Herbal knowledge persists, but now it's whispered about more cautiously. Too much knowledge looks suspicious. Too much control looks defiant. The body becomes a site of moral scrutiny, not just survival strategy. You watch women in particular absorb this shift unevenly. The promise of spiritual equality is appealing. The reality of sexual guilt is suffocating. Desire that was once navigated becomes something to confess. Silence changes shape. It's no longer just strategic, it's internalized. A scholarly debate echoes here. Did Christianity reduce sexual violence by promoting monogamy and condemning coercion? Or did it simply push abuse further into the private sphere? The sources suggest both outcomes depending on time and place. What's clear is that public accountability shifts inward. Sin replaces shame as the primary regulator. You hear a story about a man who freed his concubines after conversion. It's told admiringly. But no one mentions where those women went afterward. Liberation without support can be its own danger. Christianity changes rules faster than it builds safety nets. As the day unfolds, you notice how children are taught differently. Sex is no longer framed primarily as alliance or fertility. It's framed as temptation. That changes how fear operates. Before, fear was external. Law, violence, insult. Now it's internal. Guilt, damnation, the soul's fate. That's a powerful shift. Another quirky detail slips into your awareness. Early Scandinavian churches sometimes reused pagan sacred sites, layering new morality onto old ritual ground. Scholars debate symbolism versus convenience. Either way, sex, like belief, is being recontextualized rather than erased. You think about masculinity again. Christian ideals of restraint align strangely well with existing honor culture. Control, discipline, authority, these translate easily. What changes is justification. Masculinity no longer proves itself through dominance alone, but through moral superiority. That's a subtle but potent evolution. Women's sexuality, meanwhile, becomes more tightly surveilled. Virginity gains new symbolic weight. Widowhood becomes morally safer than remarriage. Desire without marriage is no longer just risky, it's sinful. The margins for maneuver shrink. As evening approaches, you sit near the fire listening to arguments that go in circles. Old ways worked. New ways promise salvation. Both claim order. Neither erases fear. Sex remains dangerous. It just has a new vocabulary. A scholarly debate hums softly beneath the tension. Was Christianization a sexual revolution, or a sexual repression? The answer resists simplicity. It's a redistribution of control, not a disappearance of desire. As night settles, you lie down aware that this collision is far from over. Generations will live inside the overlap, practicing one set of rules publicly and another privately. Sex will continue, as it always has, but it will be judged by new standards that don't quite fit the old world yet. Tomorrow, you'll hear the law codes speak more clearly, written down, fixed, moralized. For now, you rest with the understanding that Christianity doesn't end Viking sexuality. It reframes it, and reframing can be just as disruptive as destruction. You wake to a new kind of rigidity in the air, as if yesterday's arguments have begun to harden into rules. Words that once floated, suggestions, customs, expectations, are now being pinned down, written, counted, enforced. Today, you listen as law codes begin to speak more loudly than memory, and sexuality becomes something to be regulated line by line. You notice the difference immediately. Disputes are no longer settled only by who remembers best or who has the most kin present. Someone produces a carved staff, another recites from memory with unusual precision. One historical fact anchors this shift. As Christianity spread, Scandinavian societies increasingly recorded laws in writing, transforming flexible oral traditions into fixed legal codes that explicitly addressed sexual behaviour. You sit at the edge of a gathering where rules are being recited, not argued, not negotiated, simply stated, this matters. Oral law allowed adaptation, written law resists it. Sex, which once lived in grey areas shaped by status and circumstance, now finds itself boxed into categories: lawful, unlawful, punishable, sinful. A quirky detail surfaces as you listen. Early law codes often list sexual offences alongside property crimes, as if bodies and land belong in the same column. Scholars debate whether this reflects lingering pagan ideas of ownership or Christian moral ordering. Either way, it makes something explicit that was once implicit. Sexual behaviour is a matter of public regulation. You hear familiar issues framed differently now. Adultery isn't just a threat to lineage, it's an offence against divine order. Concubinage isn't merely discouraged, it's condemned. Divorce becomes restricted, hedged with conditions that make exit harder. The law isn't inventing new concerns, it's recoding old ones in moral language. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath this transformation. Did written law make Viking sexual norms harsher or simply more consistent? Some historians argue that codification reduced arbitrary violence by clarifying penalties. Others suggest it stripped away situational flexibility that once protected the vulnerable. Sitting here, you sense both outcomes unfolding at once. You watch how power adapts. Elite men learn the new language quickly, framing their authority in Christian virtue rather than raw dominance. Control persists, justification changes. Those with resources navigate the transition smoothly. Those without are crushed between old expectations and new rules. You think back to sexual insults and notice something subtle. They don't disappear, they change. Accusations now invoke sin rather than shame. But the effect is similar. Reputation still kills. Law simply provides new vocabulary for the same outcomes. Another historical fact settles quietly. Early Christian laws often imposed harsher penalties on women for sexual transgressions than on men, especially regarding premarital sex or infidelity. Scholars argue whether this reflects biblical influence or existing patriarchal norms reinforced by religion. The result, either way, is tightening control over female bodies. You notice women listening carefully. Knowledge of the law becomes survival skill. What was once negotiated quietly now requires legal awareness. Ignorance carries risk. Silence becomes more dangerous when words are written elsewhere. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes raise feels apt here. Writing laws about sex may have been less about changing behaviour and more about signalling authority. Declaring rules is a performance. It tells people who gets to define morality. The act of writing is itself an assertion of control. You hear debates about penalties, fines, exile, public penance. The emphasis shifts from compensation to correction. Sex is no longer just something that causes harm. It's something that requires moral response. Punishment aims not only to restore balance, but to reform the sinner. You think about confession, newly introduced, and how it transforms secrecy. Before, silence protected you. Now, silence can be guilt. Speaking becomes a requirement. That inversion is profound. Desire moves from the social sphere into the interior one. Surveillance turns inward. You watch a young man struggle to reconcile expectations. He's grown up hearing one set of rules. Now another overlays it. Which one applies? The answer depends on who's watching. Law doesn't replace custom overnight. It competes with it. Another quirky detail slips into your awareness. Some early laws specify sexual positions, times, or intentions considered sinful. Scholars debate enforcement, but the specificity itself is striking. Bodies are being mapped morally. What was once practical becomes doctrinal. You think back to fertility rituals and see how they're quietly erased from legal memory. They don't vanish in practice, but they vanish from legitimacy. What isn't written becomes illicit by default. The law reshapes reality by omission. As the day unfolds, you feel how exhausting this transition must be. Two moral systems overlapping, sometimes contradicting, sometimes reinforcing each other. Sex becomes a minefield. Do what your kin expect, or what the priest demands. Often, the answer is both, carefully. You notice how enslaved people and the poor are treated under these new codes. Penalties fall harder. There's less room for negotiation. Written law favours those who can navigate it. Sexual transgressions become another way inequality is formalised. A scholarly debate echoes softly beneath everything you hear. Did codified law protect society, or did it protect authority? The evidence resists clean conclusions. What's clear is that once sex enters written law, it never fully escapes it. As evening approaches, you sit near the fire watching someone practice recitation, repeating rules until they stick. Law becomes memory. Memory becomes habit. Habit becomes morality. Sex is slowly being trained into new patterns. Not erased, not tamed, but redirected. You realise how much this changes the future. Written law travels. It outlives individuals. It carries sexual norms forward, long after the world that birthed them has shifted. What was once flexible becomes precedent. As night settles, you lie down aware that the ground beneath desire is hardening. The room hasn't changed, bodies still lie close, but the meaning of what happens between them is being rewritten elsewhere, in words that won't forget. Tomorrow, you'll step back from lore and into material evidence, objects, graves, and the quiet hints archaeology leaves behind about intimate lives. For now, you rest with the understanding that once sex becomes law, it stops belonging entirely to the people who practice it. You wake with a different kind of silence today, one that isn't enforced by law or shame but by time itself. Voices fade, bodies turn to soil. What remains are objects, quiet, stubborn, and frustratingly incomplete. Today you learn how archaeology whispers about sex without ever saying the word. You walk beyond the settlement to places where the ground has been disturbed carefully, deliberately. Graves, refuse pits, abandoned buildings. One historical fact anchors your footing. Much of what we know about Viking Age daily life, including intimacy, comes from material culture rather than written testimony, especially for periods and people excluded from elite narratives. You feel immediately how indirect this knowledge is. No one buried a love letter and labelled it as such. What you have instead are bed frames worn smooth in specific places, combs carried everywhere, obsessively, amulets placed close to the pelvis. Objects don't explain themselves, they suggest. A quirky detail surfaces from archaeological studies. Viking Age combs are among the most common personal items found in graves, often carried by both men and women. Scholars debate whether this reflects hygiene, status, or appearance. Sitting with the idea, you realise it's probably all three. Grooming matters in a world where bodies are always visible. Desire begins with presentation. You notice how graves tell stories without language. Couples buried near one another, children placed carefully at a woman's side. In some cases, a man and woman buried together without clear evidence of marriage. Scholars argue whether these reflect love, convenience, or later disturbance. Archaeology doesn't give certainty, it gives proximity. You linger over burial goods that feel intimate, beads worn smooth by skin contact, rings bent from years of use, small knives placed where hands would naturally rest. None of these prove affection, but they suggest habit, repetition, a life lived close to one's body. Sex doesn't leave bones behind, but it shapes how people move through space. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath these observations. Can archaeology ever tell us about emotion or desire, or does it only map behaviour? Some argue inferring intimacy from objects risks projection. Others counter that refusing to interpret leaves vast areas of human experience unexplored. Standing here, you feel the tension. Silence can be respectful, or it can erase. You think about fertility again when you see tiny amulets shaped vaguely like human figures or animals, placed near women's remains. Scholars debate their purpose, protection, fertility, identity. None of the interpretations are definitive, but the placement matters. Objects close to the body usually mean something personal. You also notice absence. Enslaved people rarely receive grave goods. Their bodies are often buried without ceremony or not recovered at all. Sexual lives lived in captivity leave almost no archaeological trace. Silence here isn't neutral. It mirrors social erasure. Another historical fact settles quietly. Shared sleeping platforms in longhouses are confirmed archaeologically, supporting saga descriptions of communal sleeping. This reinforces what you've already felt. Privacy was rare. Sex happened within earshot. That reality shapes intimacy in ways no artifact can fully capture. You step into the remains of a longhouse foundation and imagine how bodies once moved through it. Where people lay down, where fires burned, where shadows fell. Archaeology can map space, and space tells you how bodies intersected, where sex could happen, and where it couldn't avoid being overheard. A fringe interpretation some scholars suggest flickers through your mind. The arrangement of household space may have functioned as sexual regulation, not just practicality. Proximity enforces norms. When everyone hears everything, behaviour aligns quickly. It's surveillance without walls.
You examine objects linked to Seder, staffs, unusual pendants, items placed in atypical graves. These finds reignite debates about gender, sexuality, and magic. Were these individuals revered, feared, marginalized? Archaeology can't tell you how they were treated in life, only that they were marked in death. That marking alone suggests difference mattered. You notice how children's graves are sometimes lavish, sometimes stark. The inconsistency mirrors what you've already learned. Attachment exists, but it's uneven. Survival is uncertain. Sex produces life, but life isn't guaranteed long enough to shape material legacy. You think about contraception and abortion again and feel the frustration archaeology brings. Herbs rot, knowledge vanishes. Practices that left no durable objects are almost impossible to trace. Scholars debate endlessly, but the ground remains mute. The absence of evidence becomes its own kind of evidence, of secrecy, risk, and oral transmission. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some graves include animal bones placed suggestively near human remains. Fertility symbols? Offerings? Coincidence? Scholars disagree, but repetition suggests intention. Sex, ritual, and death may have been linked more closely than modern categories allow. You walk among stones etched with runes, many of them commemorative, some insulting, some ambiguous. A few hint at relationships, shared property, shared journeys, shared loss. None spell out intimacy directly, but the emotional weight is there, compressed into formulaic phrases. Love, if it existed, learned how to hide inside convention. A scholarly debate echoes softly. Do we overemphasize the sexual in interpreting artifacts because we're hungry for it, or have previous generations avoided it out of discomfort? The pendulum swings. Modern scholarship tries to balance curiosity with restraint. The risk of erasure competes with the risk of projection. You notice how material culture reflects inequality. Elite graves overflow with objects. Ordinary people leave few traces. Sexual lives differ accordingly, not in desire, but in documentation. Power decides what gets remembered. The archaeology of sex is also the archaeology of silence. As the day fades, you realize archaeology doesn't contradict what you've learned so far. It confirms it obliquely. Crowded spaces, uneven status, gendered objects, fertility anxiety, control without privacy, everything aligns just without commentary. You sit on a stone warmed by the sun and think about how future historians will read your own time. What objects will survive? What desires will vanish without record? The thought humbles you. You've been asking the ground to speak about things people barely spoke about when alive. A final historical fact settles in gently. Archaeology has revealed that Viking Age communities were more diverse and interconnected than earlier scholarship assumed. With that diversity comes sexual variety, unrecorded, unmanaged, undocumented. Desire likely exceeded the categories imposed on it. As evening approaches, you feel the quiet satisfaction of partial understanding. Archaeology doesn't tell you what sex felt like. It tells you where it mattered, where people invested resources, where they marked bodies with meaning. You lie down again, aware that tomorrow you'll hear voices again, foreign ones, outsiders describing Viking sexuality with fascination, horror, and misunderstanding. For now, you rest with the knowledge that the ground remembers what people tried to forget. And if you listen carefully, it still tells the truth, just not all at once. You wake to unfamiliar eyes today, eyes that don't belong to the world you've been living in, but that stare in from the outside with curiosity, judgment, and a hint of fascination. These are foreign voices now, and they change the story simply by telling it. Viking sexuality, once governed by internal rules, is suddenly being described by people who don't share them. You hear these voices through retellings, travelers' accounts, letters, sermons. One historical fact anchors their presence. Several non-Scandinavian writers, including Arab travelers, Christian monks, and diplomats, left descriptions of Viking societies, often focusing intensely on sexual behavior, hygiene, and gender roles. Outsiders always notice the body first. You feel the tension immediately. These observers are both impressed and repulsed. They describe Vikings bathing regularly, grooming obsessively, sharing spaces without shame. At the same time, they recoil at perceived promiscuity, nudity, and moral looseness. Clean bodies, dirty morals, that contradiction fascinates them. A quirky detail surfaces from one such account. An Arab observer describes Scandinavian men washing their faces and combing their hair daily, a practice he found excessive and suspiciously vain. Scholars debate the accuracy of his interpretation, but the fixation is telling. Sexuality, for outsiders, is often inferred from appearance. Care for the body becomes evidence of moral decay. You notice how these accounts exaggerate. Nuance disappears, power dynamics flatten. What you've seen as structured, marriage, hierarchy, law, gets recast as chaos. Concubinage becomes lust, ritual becomes orgy, gender complexity becomes perversion. Outsiders don't describe systems, they describe shocks. There's an open scholarly debate that hums beneath these texts. How much of what foreign observers wrote reflects reality, and how much reflects their own anxieties? Many accounts were written to entertain, warn, or morally instruct home audiences. Sensational sex sells. Accuracy is optional. You think back to what you've learned about shame and insult, and you see how irony works here. Vikings themselves used sexual accusation strategically, but foreigners weaponize it differently, turning cultural difference into proof of inferiority. Sex becomes a marker of civilization, or lack thereof. You hear Christian writers emphasize pagan sexuality as sinful, uncontrolled, animalistic. This isn't neutral observation, it's propaganda. By portraying Vikings as sexually corrupt, missionaries justify conversion, conquest, and moral superiority. Sex becomes the battlefield where belief systems clash. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Many of these foreign accounts are among the earliest written descriptions of Scandinavians, meaning later historians relied on them heavily despite their bias. First impressions fossilize quickly. Once written, stereotypes persist. You notice how women are portrayed almost exclusively through male fantasy or fear. Viking women are described as seductive, aggressive, immodest. Scholars argue whether these depictions reflect real female autonomy or male anxiety about it. Probably both, but filtered through exaggeration. A fringe interpretation some scholars suggest feels uncomfortably accurate. Outsiders may have been responding less to Viking sexual behavior itself and more to the visibility of it. Communal living, public bathing, and shared sleeping spaces make intimacy observable. What is hidden feels moral. What is visible feels dangerous. You think about queer behavior again and see how it's distorted by foreign eyes. Acts that Vikings themselves framed through power roles get recast as identity-based deviants. Outsiders impose categories that don't fit, then condemn them. Misunderstanding becomes moral outrage. You notice something else too. Foreign writers rarely mention consent, coercion, or slavery. Captive bodies disappear from the narrative. Sex is portrayed as choice when it's actually structured by power. This omission isn't accidental. Acknowledging exploitation would complicate the moral binary they're constructing. There's a scholarly debate that pulses beneath these observations. Did foreign accounts shape Viking self-identity in return? Some historians argue that as Scandinavians encountered these judgments, they began adjusting behavior, emphasizing restraint, adopting Christian sexual norms, reframing practices to avoid ridicule. Shame, once internal, becomes external. You see how this might work. Being called barbaric stings. Being called immoral stings more. Sex becomes a site of negotiation not just within society, but between cultures. What was once acceptable becomes embarrassing when seen through foreign eyes. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some later saga writers appear to downplay sexual openness compared to earlier poetry, possibly reflecting growing Christian influence and awareness of external judgment. Scholars debate intentional revision versus changing norms. Either way, storytelling adapts. You notice how fascination cuts both ways. Outsiders condemn Viking sexuality, but they're also obsessed with it. They describe bodies in detail. They linger on rituals. They repeat rumors. Disgust and desire intertwine. The other is always eroticized. You think about how these accounts travel, copied, quoted, preached. Each retelling strips more context. Sex becomes shorthand for savagery. By the time Vikings are remembered in distant places, their sexual lives are caricatures, either wildly free or dangerously deviant. A scholarly debate echoes softly. Are these sources usable at all, or should they be treated primarily as mirrors of the writer's cultures? Modern historians try to triangulate, balancing outsider shock with insider silence. Truth lives in overlap. As the day unfolds, you realize how much damage a narrative can do. Being described shapes how you're treated. Foreign depictions justify raids, conversions, laws. Sex isn't just misunderstood, it's mobilized. You sit and imagine hearing your own life described by someone who doesn't understand your rules. Which parts would they fixate on? Which parts would they miss entirely? The thought is uncomfortable and clarifying. Another historical fact settles in gently. Some of the most enduring myths about Viking sexual freedom originate not from Viking sources, but from later European Romanticism reacting against Christian repression. Outsiders project fantasies both negative and positive. The pendulum swings wildly. You realize that Viking sexuality becomes a screen onto which others project fear, longing, and judgment. It's no longer just about how people lived. It's about what others needed them to represent. As evening approaches, you feel the narrative slipping out of Viking hands. Their sexual practices, already changing under Christian influence, are now frozen in outsider memory, misunderstood, simplified, moralized. You lie down knowing tomorrow will pull you back into modern debates, historians arguing fiercely over interpretation, evidence, and bias. For now, you rest with the awareness that sex doesn't just shape societies. It shapes reputations long after the people themselves are gone. And sometimes, the loudest stories told about a culture's sexuality say less about them, and far more about the ones doing the watching. You wake into argument today, not shouted, but layered, patient, relentless. This is the sound of modern voices now, circling the past with tools sharpened by theory, evidence, and disagreement. The Vikings themselves are gone, but the debate over their sexual lives is very much alive, and it's far from settled. You notice how careful language becomes here. Historians hedge, they qualify. They disagree politely in print and ferociously in footnotes. One historical fact anchors this tension clearly. Much of what we think we know about Viking sexuality rests on a limited corpus of sources. Sagas written centuries later, biased foreign accounts, fragmented law codes, and ambiguous archaeology. Certainty is impossible. Interpretation fills the gaps. You sit with scholars who argue that Viking sexuality was more pragmatic than permissive. Sex served lineage, alliance, and survival. Pleasure existed, but it wasn't centered. Others push back, pointing to frequent bathing, grooming, flexible marriage practices, and relative openness compared to later Christian norms. To them, Vikings appear unusually unashamed of the body. Both camps cite the same evidence. That's what makes the debate so persistent. A quirky detail surfaces from academic history itself. Early 20th century scholars often downplayed Viking sexual complexity to align them with respectable European ancestry, while later scholars emphasized sexual openness as a corrective to Victorian prudishness. Every era remakes the Vikings it needs. Objectivity is aspirational, not guaranteed. You notice how terminology becomes a battleground. Words like consent, rape, homosexuality, and agency don't map neatly onto Viking concepts. Some scholars argue we must use modern terms to discuss harm and power honestly. Others warn that doing so risks anachronism, forcing contemporary moral frameworks onto a world that operated differently. The debate isn't academic nitpicking, it shapes conclusions. There's an open scholarly debate that refuses to quiet down. Were Viking women relatively empowered, or is that a comforting myth built on selective evidence? Divorce rights, property control, and ritual roles suggest agency. Slavery, forced marriage, and sexual double standards suggest constraint. You've seen enough now to know the answer isn't singular. Power here was situational, uneven, and often fragile. You think back to queerness and notice how scholarship fractures again. Some argue that same-sex behavior was common, but unremarked as long as power roles remained intact. Others caution that silence doesn't equal acceptance. and that stigma around passivity implies broader intolerance. The evidence supports discomfort more clearly than freedom. Desire likely existed in abundance. Safety did not. Another historical fact settles quietly. No surviving Viking Age text advocates sexual equality, pleasure-based ethics, or mutual consent as primary values. When sex appears in sources, it's usually because something went wrong, an insult, a lawsuit, a feud. Normality leaves fewer traces than conflict. You watch debates unfold over archaeology. Does a joint burial imply romance or convenience? Does a phallic amulet signal ritual or humor? Does a woman buried with weapons challenge gender norms or confirm exceptionalism? Scholars argue fiercely because material culture refuses to explain itself. Every interpretation is provisional. A fringe interpretation some historians raise feels almost philosophical. Perhaps Viking sexuality feels opaque, not because it was exotic, but because it was deeply embedded in everyday survival. When sex is normalized as labor, alliance, and reproduction, it doesn't generate commentary. Modern obsession may say more about us than about them. You notice how morality creeps into scholarship even when denied. Scholars are people. They flinch at slavery. They recoil from coercion. They're drawn to stories of resistance and autonomy. This doesn't invalidate their work, but it shapes emphasis. Which questions get asked matters as much as the answers. You think about how Christianity complicates interpretation. Was sexual repression a Christian imposition, or did it formalize anxieties already present? Some argue Viking culture was already restrictive, simply in different ways. Others see a clear tightening around pleasure, guilt, and gender under Christian norms. The transition blurs cause and effect. Another scholarly debate hums beneath everything. Should Viking sexuality be judged, contextualized, or bracketed entirely? Some historians insist on moral clarity when discussing exploitation. Others argue for descriptive neutrality. You realize that neither approach alone is sufficient. Understanding doesn't require approval, but it does require honesty. You hear discussions about modern media, how Vikings are portrayed as either hypersexual libertines or brutal misogynists. Both images flatten reality. Scholars push back, but popular culture is loud. Sex sells, and nuance doesn't trend well. You think about how modern identities look for ancestors. Queer readers search for traces of themselves. Feminist scholars search for women's voices. Nationalists search for strength and purity. Everyone wants something from the Vikings. That desire shapes interpretation more than most admit. A historical fact lands with quiet weight. Archaeology and genetics increasingly reveal Viking societies as diverse, interconnected, and mobile. With diversity comes varied sexual practices, none of which fit a single model. Any claim that starts with "the Vikings believed" is immediately suspect. You notice how debates rarely conclude. They evolve. New finds reopen old questions. Old assumptions crumble. That uncertainty isn't failure, it's honesty. The past doesn't owe you clarity. As the day unfolds, you feel yourself step back from needing definitive answers. The arguments themselves become instructive. They show how hard it is to speak about sex across centuries without distorting it, through judgment, fantasy, or silence. You sit quietly and think about everything you've seen so far. Crowded longhouses, whispered negotiations, laws spoken aloud, rituals under open sky, births balanced on survival. Sex in the Viking Age wasn't free or forbidden, it was consequential. That may be the closest truth anyone can reach. A scholarly debate echoes softly as the light fades. Is it better to leave ambiguity intact, or to risk interpretation in pursuit of understanding? Most choose the risk. Silence can be another kind of distortion. As night settles, you realize tomorrow will bring you back to daily life again. Not theory, but exhaustion, hunger, routine. Sex will reappear not as idea, but as something folded into chores and sleep. For now, you rest with the awareness that history isn't just what happened, it's what we argue about afterward. And when it comes to sex, those arguments reveal as much about the present as they ever will about the Viking past. You wake to the ache of ordinary life again, the kind that doesn't care about debate or doctrine. Your back is stiff, the air is cold. Someone is already arguing about food. After gods, law, and scholarship, this is where everything finally lands. In routine. Sex here doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like something squeezed between hunger and exhaustion. You watch people move through the morning with practiced efficiency. Chores come first. Animals need tending. Nets need mending. Bread needs baking. One historical fact anchors this return to reality. The majority of Viking Age people lived physically demanding lives, with long hours of labor that left little energy for indulgence or fantasy. Sex existed, but it competed with survival. You feel how tired everyone is. That matters. Desire doesn't vanish, but it changes tone when bodies are sore and sleep is shallow. Sex becomes functional more often than expressive, not joyless, just practical. A way to maintain bonds, a way to warm up, a way to fulfill expectation without ceremony. A quirky detail surfaces as you notice how people share space. Communal sleeping means everyone is aware of who pairs up and when. Privacy is minimal, but so is voyeurism. Familiarity dulls novelty. Sex isn't constantly interesting when it's always nearby. It's folded into background noise like coughing or snoring. You think back to fertility rituals and law codes and realize how rarely those abstractions intrude here. Most days don't involve scandal, magic, or judgment. They involve repetition. The system only shows its sharp edges when something goes wrong. Otherwise, it hums along quietly. There's an open scholarly debate that fits perfectly here. Do historians overemphasize sexual conflict because conflict leaves records? Daily, consensual, uneventful sex doesn't generate sagas or lawsuits. It generates children, fatigue, and routine. Sitting here, you suspect that most intimacy in the Viking Age looked like this: unremarkable, unrecorded, and emotionally muted by necessity. You watch a couple exchange a brief touch while passing a bucket. It's not romantic in the modern sense, but it's familiar, comforting. There's trust there, built through shared labor rather than passion. Sex in this context is less about desire and more about continuity. You also see how little time there is for negotiation. Consent, when it happens, is often assumed through routine rather than discussed. That doesn't make it safe or equal. It makes it invisible. When expectations are stable, questioning them takes energy people don't have. A fringe interpretation, some scholars suggest, feels grounded here. Viking sexual norms may have been less ideologically driven than situationally enforced. People did what worked until it didn't. When it stopped working, when jealousy flared, when lineage blurred, when power was threatened, the rules suddenly mattered. You think about enslaved people again and feel how daily reality sharpens injustice. Their labor never pauses. Their bodies are never fully theirs. Sex for them isn't squeezed between chores. It's added to them. Routine exploitation leaves no dramatic trace, just endurance. Another historical fact settles quietly. Average life expectancy was low, not because everyone died young, but because childhood mortality was high. Adults who survived childhood often lived into middle age or beyond. That means sex wasn't a short-term concern. It stretched across decades of repetition. Familiar bodies, familiar expectations. You notice how aging fits back into daily life. Older people contribute knowledge rather than strength. Their sexuality, if present, is private in a different way, not hidden, just irrelevant to household function. No one comments, no one cares. Survival doesn't depend on it anymore. You hear laughter erupt suddenly over something mundane. Humor here is crude, bodily, often sexual, but not erotic. Jokes about sex relieve tension. They normalize what can't be escaped. Laughter becomes a pressure valve in a life this constrained. A scholarly debate hums softly beneath this scene. Was Viking sexual culture harsh because people were brutal, or because life was? The distinction matters. Hard conditions don't excuse harm. but they explain why ideals like mutual fulfillment never became central values. You can't prioritize self-actualization when winter might kill you. You watch children mimic adults without understanding the meaning behind actions. They learn early who sleeps where, who belongs to whom. Sex education here isn't instructional, it's observational. Knowledge seeps in without guidance, shaped by power and repetition. Another quirky detail surfaces. Household pets and animals move freely through sleeping spaces. This blurs boundaries modern people rely on. Bodies are bodies here, human and animal alike. That constant physicality changes how sex is perceived. It's not elevated, it's embodied. You realize how modern discomfort often comes from expecting sex to be special. In this world, it rarely is. It's important, yes. Dangerous, yes. But not sacred, not private, not expressive in the ways you're used to imagining. You think back to foreign observers and understand their shock better now. From the outside, this looks crude. From the inside, it's normal. Judgment depends on distance. A historical fact slips in gently. Feast days and festivals were exceptions, times when routine loosened and sex may have taken on more celebratory tones. Scholars debate how wild these gatherings were, but the very existence of exceptions suggests how restrained daily life usually was. You watch the sun climb higher and feel the day pulling people back to work. There's no lingering over last night, no analysis. Sex doesn't define identity here. It doesn't demand reflection. It's something you do, like eating or sleeping, until it causes trouble. You sit with the realization that boredom is as important to understanding Viking sexuality as violence or ritual. Boredom dulls desire. It makes routine intimacy tolerable rather than thrilling. It explains why scandal stands out so starkly against a backdrop of sameness. A scholarly debate echoes faintly. Have modern historians romanticized Viking sexuality by focusing on extremes, raids, rituals, law-breaking, while ignoring the monotony that actually shaped most lives? The answer feels uncomfortably likely. As evening approaches, people return tired and quiet. Meals are simple, conversations sparse. Couples lie down, not with anticipation, but with relief. Sleep matters more than sex tonight, and tomorrow night, and most nights. You lie down among them again, feeling how closeness here isn't always chosen, but it's constant. Bodies adapt, expectations settle. Desire becomes something you live with rather than chase. Tomorrow you'll confront the myths, the movies, the fantasies, the modern distortions that flatten everything you've learned into spectacle. For now, you rest with the understanding that the darkest truth of sex in the Viking Age may not be violence or shame. It may be that most of the time, it was simply another task in a life already overflowing with them. You wake today surrounded by ghosts that aren't old at all. They wear helmets with horns, leather straps cut for drama, and expressions borrowed from modern fantasy. This is the final layer you have to peel back. The myths, the movies, the comfortable lies told about Viking sexuality that flatten everything you've seen into spectacle. You notice how familiar these images feel. Vikings as endlessly virile, women as fiercely liberated or perpetually victimized, sex as either wild freedom or constant brutality. One historical fact grounds the correction immediately. Nearly all popular images of Viking sexuality were created centuries after the Viking Age, shaped by Victorian morality, nationalist myth-making, and modern entertainment rather than historical evidence. You feel the gap between fantasy and fatigue. The Viking Age you've walked through is crowded, hierarchical, exhausting, and constrained. The Viking Age of movies is spacious, muscular, and conveniently free. Sex, in fantasy, is expressive and identity-defining. Sex, in reality, was consequential and monitored. A quirky detail surfaces when you think about horned helmets. Never actually worn in battle, but popularized in 19th century opera. Scholars use this as shorthand for a larger problem. If we're willing to believe obvious costume myths, what subtler myths slip through unnoticed? Sexual freedom is one of them. You think about how often Vikings are portrayed as sexually progressive, especially compared to medieval Christians. There's a grain of truth there, less emphasis on sin, more on consequence. But the leap to liberation is modern wishful thinking. Sex wasn't moralized as sin, but it was heavily regulated by power, status, and survival. Freedom didn't factor in. There's an open scholarly debate that intersects directly with pop culture. Does emphasizing Viking sexual freedom challenge later Christian repression, or does it simply replace one distortion with another? Some argue the myth serves a purpose, reminding people that sexual norms are culturally constructed. Others warn it erases exploitation, coercion, and inequality. Sitting with everything you've seen, the warning feels justified. You notice how modern stories crave extremes. Either Vikings are brutal misogynists or proto-feminists. Either sex is savage or enlightened. Reality resists that. Women had agency and faced violence. Men were dominant and anxious. Desire existed everywhere, but safety did not. That complexity doesn't fit clean narratives. You think back to enslaved people and realize how completely they vanish from popular depictions. Viking sex scenes rarely include the people most vulnerable to exploitation. Their absence sanitizes the past. It turns hierarchy into heroism. Silence becomes complicity. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Even within the Viking Age, sexual norms varied by region, status, and time. There was no single Viking view of sex. Any story that presents one is already fiction. Diversity doesn't make good branding, but it makes good history. You feel how modern fantasies often center desire as identity, who you are defined by who you want. That framework simply doesn't apply here. In the Viking Age, sex didn't define you. It tested you, it positioned you, it endangered you. Identity was forged through kin, land, and reputation, not attraction. A fringe interpretation scholars sometimes raise feels important now. Modern audiences may be drawn to Viking sexuality precisely because it appears unburdened by modern guilt, even if that's untrue. The fantasy offers escape from contemporary anxieties, not insight into the past. Vikings become mirrors, not subjects. You notice how violence is stylized in fiction, clean, purposeful, heroic. Sexual violence, when acknowledged, is often minimized or framed as aberration. In reality, it was structural, especially under slavery. Ignoring that doesn't make stories more respectful. It makes them dishonest. You think about how movies love to show Viking women choosing partners freely, sword in hand. Real women navigated marriage through negotiation, kin pressure, fertility risk, and survival strategy. Their strength wasn't flashy. It was procedural. That doesn't translate well to screen, so it's replaced. A scholarly debate echoes faintly. Does popular history need to be accurate to be valuable? Some argue inspiration matters more than precision. Others insist that myths shape modern attitudes toward sex, power, and gender. You've seen enough now to know that stories matter. They teach people what to admire and what to ignore. You feel a quiet frustration with how often sex is used as shorthand for cultural difference. Vikings were not defined by how much sex they had or how openly. They were defined by how sex intersected with survival. Strip that context away, and everything becomes noise. You think back to daily life, tired bodies, shared beds, routine intimacy. That image never makes it into fantasy. It's not exciting enough, but it's the truth that explains everything else. Without it, the scandals, laws, and rituals make no sense. Another historical fact settles gently. The Viking Age wasn't an era of constant raids and feasts, but of farming, trade, and domestic labor. Sex lived in that world, not the other way around. Remembering that dissolves most myths instantly. As evening approaches, you feel a strange calm. The layers have peeled away, myth, law, ritual, debate, leaving something quieter underneath. Not a moral lesson, not a warning, just a human pattern shaped by harsh conditions. You realize that modern portrayals often ask, were Vikings good or bad about sex? That question misses the point. The better question is, what did sex do in their world? And the answer is complicated, uncomfortable, and deeply ordinary. You lie down one final time, aware that nothing you've learned makes the Viking Age admirable or monstrous in simple terms. It makes it human, uncomfortably so. Sex wasn't freedom, it wasn't sin. It was leverage, labor, risk, routine, and occasionally comfort. It shaped futures more than feelings. And it rarely cared what anyone wanted it to mean. That's the dark truth. Not that Vikings were unusually cruel or liberated, but that sex, stripped of modern romance, looks like power management in a world where survival comes first. As you settle into stillness, let your breathing slow and your thoughts soften. You've walked through crowded longhouses and legal assemblies, through ritual fields and quiet graves. You've seen sex not as fantasy, but as function, woven into survival, hierarchy, and exhaustion. If your mind is still busy sorting judgment from understanding, that's okay. History isn't meant to comfort. It's meant to ground you. And now, gently, you can let it go. The Viking Age doesn't need to be admired or condemned tonight. It just needs to be understood, then set down. The people you followed are long gone. Their rules no longer bind you. Their fears no longer apply. So let the fire fade. Let the arguments quiet. Let the myths dissolve. You're safe here. You're warm. And you don't have to survive the night the way they did.